Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads for our first canon book club video-esque video. This is the first time we've done this for something canon related that hasn't been Legends book club, but this is going to be our High Republic retrospective rankings, Trials of the Jedi spoiler discussion, all of that stuff here in tonight's stream. We're going to talk about the High Republic and just all the things we liked, disliked, what we would change, how we compare it to other Star Wars publishing initiatives with New Jedi Order, Clone Wars Multimedia Project, Shadows of the Empire, some of these other ones we've seen in the past, and what we think that Lucasfilm and Disney and the people behind the Star Wars publishing side right now can learn from the High Republic and where they can go here in the future. We'll also be giving you guys some of our rankings for the adult novels, young adult novels, and junior novels, and we'll be talking about some comics as well as the other tie-in material that really does separate the High Republic from most of the other big publishing initiatives is the fact that it has had so much other tie-in and other mediums across the board, a true multimedia initiative. So we're going to talk about all of that stuff in tonight's stream. But before we do so, make sure you hit the like button. It really helps our channel out. It helps our videos out. It helps the stream out. It helps it get to more people who enjoy the High Republic. We have such a good High Republic community currently on our channel. We'd love to have even more people a part of that. So make sure you hit the like button. It really does help us out. More people are watching right now than have liked the video. So that really does help if you hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more content just like this, even though the High Republic is ending and it's not completely over yet. There are still some comics yet to come out. But even though it is pretty much getting to that point where it's over, at least phase 1 through 3, there will be more, inevitably be more stories post phase 3 here in the future. But even though it's coming to a close, we still cover pretty much every single Star Wars book that comes out, as well as a variety of other big topics on the channel, including a lot of Legends content too. So if you're just a fan of Star Wars books and you want a place that talks about so many different types of Star Wars books, make sure you subscribe to our channel. And as you can see, people are sending in chats. You can send in your chats and comment along with us about the different topics from the stream tonight. Send it in to the chat room and we will get to it. It is usually first come, first serve, but the way to bypass that is to send in a super chat that bumps you up to the top. We will absolutely answer your super chat tonight before the stream has ended. And if you are a member of the Patreon or YouTube membership programs of Star Wars Lads, you are able to have priority chat access. If you're of a certain tier, if you're on Patreon and you're watching the stream right now, comment below the post or send us a DM and let us know your specific handle for YouTube so we can give you that priority chat access. And then, of course, you could also just drop your comment on the post on the Patreon page as well. If you're a YouTube member of that specific tier, you will see the option to have that priority chat from your membership. All right, let's get into the topics tonight. And this is going to be a more open-ended discussion here. It's not as straightforward or streamlined as our other streams usually are, but we do have a lot of things to talk about. I've broken this down into a pretty nice rundown here. And I think we just start off broad, though, Sonic. Let's talk about the High Republic as a whole. So we have the High Republic, which has been coming out for over 4 years now at this point. It is almost over. It should be over by the end of the summer. And it's been broken up into 3 different phases. We had phase 1, which started the story, phase 2, which then went back in time 150 years to tell other stories about kind of the origins of the precursors to the Nile, the path of the open hand, and all that type of stuff. And then we come back now 150 years after that and pick up the phase 1 story with phase 3. And that has been wrapping out the High Republic for the last year and a half to 2 years. And so the High Republic has been really longer running than pretty much any other Star Wars publishing initiative has ever been. It's had a lot of different phases. In the meantime, it's had shows and video game connections and manga and comics and books. There's been so many things around the High Republic, and with all of these things coming out, looking at the initiative as a whole, what are your thoughts? What are your pros and cons? Let's start there. What are the pros and cons you saw from the way they structure the High Republic and just release this entire initiative?
I mean, this was a true multimedia initiative. It was fantastic to see them really delve into just showcasing this golden era of the Jedi and the struggles that they're facing there, and actually bringing the story and not just adult books like a lot of legends and early sort of canon trilogies have been, but just been like, you want books? Great, but we're gonna give you adult, we're gonna give you young adult, we're gonna give you junior novels, even some young readers or ones like with the, Buryaga adaptations of everything, which I thought was pretty sweet. It was pretty nice in general. So, yeah, all of that was pretty fun, but I was definitely impressed just how many different mediums they went into because it wasn't just the books like we're used to. We got audiobook adaptations, obviously, but we got audio dramas, like fully scripted stories, and we haven't really gotten many of those, I wanna say, since maybe, like, Dooku Jedi Lost and, like, just the Doctor Aphra one that we got in canon, of, like, her first initial run with Darth Vader. Not a lot there, honestly, so seeing them, like, really push that out, make some of them, like, very essential, like the Battle of Jedha one, that was a huge one in Phase 2 that's basically, like, filling in the place of an adult novel. Some really big leaps that they took, and it was nice to just see the comics just be absolutely flooded. It was a little hard to keep up with that stuff, honestly, at points, especially by the time we got to Phase 3, but it was awesome seeing Marvel, IDW, and then eventually Dark Horse kinda take over. They covered every visual medium they really could, like, it was fantastic. The only thing you could honestly say has been missing is, like, animation, and they still kinda tried doing some of that too anyways. They did some of that with, just the character introductions in Phase 1 and all that, so we'd got some of our initial imagery around this era about the villains, the heroes, state of the galaxy, and everything, so they put a lot of money into it, and as long as you could pick it up at a comic book store or a regular bookstore, they had so many options. So I think that was a huge strength for sure. And because they had all these different mediums, one big thing that we got to really see was just a galaxy at play, and that's something I feel like is always a little bit missing even in, like, a Legends universe, right? You can take something like a new Jedi Order, and you did get so much of that, but it required, like, almost 20 books just to cover a lot of that, and it was based off of a lot of stuff that's already been established from the Bantam era, from, like, those early first 10, 11 years of just what this writing was like around the Star Wars universe after Return of the Jedi, so bringing in all new characters and then saying like, "Yeah, we can introduce a lot of them in the books, but then let them kind of filter around, have some characters that are specifically for different mediums," especially what like the character of Lily from, Edge of Balance, right? That's, opening up not just a whole new avenue for, like, Star Wars fans, but also just, like, trying to bring in manga fans in there. Having that character kinda jump in here and there. She plays a small role even in Trials of the Jedi. Fantastic stuff all around. You could really feel a Jedi Order. Like, it wasn't just like, "Here's 5 people that are gonna be super important for, like, 2 books and then disappear from 3 years of publishing." It's like, okay, you might not have seen them, but that's only because they were in the comics for a while. Oh, these comic characters that you loved, actually, they were in a really big audio drama that we had. Like, they would jump around, you could feel the state of the galaxy, you'd see new characters. It made this era feel big. And I never had this feeling of, like, everybody knows everybody in the galaxy. There were Jedi who would meet each other in the books in whatever medium, and they'd be like, "I might have heard about you, but I don't know you. This is, like, our first interaction." That's something that it wasn't necessarily a weakness of, like, before, it's just not something that was ever attempted at the scale, so it was really nice to see that. So, a huge fan of all of that in general. I would say though that all those positives that I'm listing, unfortunately, also kind of plays into the negatives too, because it's cool to have characters jump around different mediums, don't get me wrong, and it's cool to have young adult books be important plot points for stuff that you see in the adult novels, even some junior novel elements, and the characters from there kinda start getting elevated into a different stratosphere as, like, a character's reception kept on growing within the Star Wars community and all that. What was wrong, though, was that at points, for some reason you'd have a character like Avar Kriss, who is fundamental to this whole initiative, who is central to this whole initiative. She would go to, like, a comic run, and you'd get some great story for her there, but then it's not really recapped, it's not really connected, it's not really made important, and that was an issue both in Phase 1 and Phase 2. I just never really understood a choice like that. I found a lot of struggles with that overall, like, why is that happening? Or, like, why are we missing out crucial elements of this character, especially once they're, like, driving towards some very big character changes, big parts of their arcs and all that. That was a huge flaw in phase 1. I think they mostly corrected it, a lot of it, by phase 3, but it was still like, I don't necessarily want that character to jump into the medium and then play a main character role. If they're gonna jump into a different medium, let the characters that have kind of been defining that comic book run, have been defining that audio drama and that those spaces, keep them as the leads and then have these characters come in as supporting and giving their own POV and giving a little bit of recap of their own stories and how these things can tie together. That started happening in phase 3, and there are definitely some of the books that recap stuff, that could be a little annoying. I could see that for sure for some people. But it was just a weird choice to have, like, a huge character like Avar kinda jump into comics, kinda take over for Kiev when she's running the Marvel's High Republic line, and then you're like, "Oh, is are we gonna get any recap of any of that stuff? No? Okay. Alright, so we're gonna get 2 sentences of that for the Fallen Star, and we're gonna have the whole bottom half of a Starlight Beacon play out in the comics and not really have that story really ever, like, make any observations or hints or even, like, just interludes about what's going on there. That's where I found a lot of the struggles, and it never truly improved from there. It was fine. It wasn't great, but, it's that ambitiousness that you can't help but fault them for trying something that big, but then you're like, "Well, the planning and organization of keeping everything together, especially in a franchise like Star Wars, it was rough. It was rough." And when things got spread out in phase 3, especially because phase 1 was just so overstuffed, everybody felt like, "Oh, man, there's too much going on right now, too much to keep up with. Everything has to be connected and whatnot." Yeah, I was like, "Yeah, that is difficult, that is annoying. I can see that." And then phase 3, you're like, "Oh, but you've balanced out the equation now, but then you've spread everything out for almost a 2-year period." Now it's like, do I feel that same drive and urge to keep up with the story? I understand in 2021, we're all at home, we're not necessarily dependent on anything outside of streaming and all that. We don't have, big sporting events. We don't have movies and stuff like that going on. This stuff can all be readily accessible, and this is stuff that we're gonna be devouring at this point. But did it need this much of a gap once you've corrected those issues that were, like, a little bit more obvious during phase 1 by phase 3? I don't know. It felt like strictly phase 2 was the most balanced, but it's also the shortest in general. There wasn't a lot of story to it, and that comes into my final flaw. I never truly understood why phase 2 had to go back and kinda pull, like, a Star Wars prequels on us. Like, there was no serious need for us to jump 150 years back. I think they could have done kinda what they're talking about now, like, the phase more where they do different stories in the High Republic, and you could have, like, played off a lot of characters, especially, like, an Aslan Rel in the manga and in the comics and, like, slowly bring them into whatever phase 3 could have been. Waiting for these characters, especially with the cliffhanger of phase 1, which is then also established in, like, a jumbo-sized 2-issue Marvel comic, you're like, "Oh, man," like, that's stuff I wanna, like, immediately address in the books because not everybody's gonna read that, and then you have to wait almost 2 years before we even come around to getting to that point. That was my big struggle with phase 2 because as I ended up loving it after Convergence was a bit of a slow start, I was like, "Well, did we necessarily need 150 years back?" Like, how much of that era ultimately defines everything going on in phase 3 and phase 1? Not that much. Like, it plays a lot more by the end, like, by wave 3 of phase 3, but it's truly not that important. It wasn't something that had to last a whole year. It could have just been stuff that was, like, interspersed, like, over a 6-month period, and I think that would've been fine. We don't necessarily need all those books. So I that's where I found a bit of a struggle, but, that's just how it is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you and the structure. I think the structuring could have been better. I'll start with my pros right off the bat. And I think the biggest pro and the reason overall the High Republic feels like such a success is the storytelling. The storytelling was overall very, very good and at times excellent. I think when they had to hit, they often hit with the storytelling. And that's the most important thing, right? You just need great storytelling. And if there's great storytelling, then you can make up for all the other flaws that are around the initiative and flaws within maybe the release strategy and spacing and stuff like that. So, above all, storytelling, at least in the novels, was always very compelling. In the adult novels, they had us, and outside of a few that weren't quite as good as the standard, they mostly had us all the way around. I would say the YA and junior novel was a little bit of a mixed bag. The junior novels overall, I like what they did in phase 3 the most, actually. It's one of the few things that I loved about phase 3 a little bit more than other phases is the junior novel set of characters in phase 3 was consistent. They kept the same characters pretty much the whole time. They plugged and played a few others, but for the most part, they kept that core group. And it helped you really fall in love with those characters and get used to those characters and embrace those characters. And I thought that was something that would have been smart to do throughout the entire initiative. For me, that's my biggest con with the whole thing is while there are still good stories, YA and junior novels especially, I don't like the whole author ownership of the characters kind of approach they took with this initiative because the initiative didn't need to rely on purely author ownership. I think with YA, we oftentimes started stories and then the next story had a different author, and therefore they relegate the main characters of the previous to smaller role and they bring in their own new characters or their characters from a junior novel or their characters from something else and they just decide to tell a story about that. And while that allows you to see more sides of the universe, it oftentimes made me care less about certain sets of characters than I did about previous sets of characters. And so I thought that was something that absolutely was a negative across the board with the way YA was handled and the way junior novels were handled in the first two phases. And I thought they could have done a better job of just, hey, these are our characters for each sets of styles, and these are the stories we're going to tell with these characters across the board. I think that would have worked far better because we have seen obviously different styles of Star Wars storytelling told in the past in initiatives that will have a variety of different authors, but they're all contributing to one grander whole. And so I think that's something that absolutely could have been tightened up for the future. I appreciate the experiment, but I don't think it really worked across the board. It made me far less excited to read the next YA book or the next junior novel because you didn't know what you were going to get. You didn't know if it was going to actually perpetuate the story or if it was just going to be another story with another new set of characters and you had to learn more new characters or then you started to develop factions, which ones you liked more, which ones you liked less. So I didn't like that overall for me in the initiative. And then, of course, as we got to the adult novels, though, they didn't do that. They focused on the characters. It was basically the same set of characters the entire time. The main, most consistent character being a part of each one outside of the phase 2 stuff, obviously, was Elzar. Elzar was one of the main characters of every single adult novel in phase 1 and phase 3. And I thought that really worked. I agree with you. The Avar sidelining after Light of the Jedi was not one of my favorites things. I like Light of the Jedi. That's one of my favorite Star Wars books in canon. And so putting her on the side, I understood for maybe one book, but to do it for two in phase 1, it kind of crippled to me that relationship in phase 1, which they do a great job of reclaiming in phase 3, but I wish that it would have had a little bit more impact at the end of phase 1 when they are separated because you do see them apart far more than you see them together. So that was a little bit of a disappointment. But overall, I did like the consistent through line how certain characters, Bell, Elzar, Buryaga, they stayed through the entire initiative, and I thought that worked very, very well. I also really liked the experimentation. I liked experimenting with new mediums, experimenting with new styles, trying different things, seeing what worked. Mini series, maxi series, full ongoing series. in comics, I thought all of that, especially in the comic experimentation, worked quite well. Jumping into short stories also was interesting, short story anthologies, audio dramas. There was so much trial and error in this series, and they really doubled down on things. And I think even some of the stories that weren't as good, hopefully publishing learned something about telling stories in those mediums, the mediums that they don't necessarily tell stories in as often. And hopefully that will contribute to the whole in the future. So I think that was a big, big positive for the way the initiative was handled. As for cons for me, outside of the author ownership, I thought phase three's release strategy was a big negative. I really liked phase one and phase two's release strategy, the idea of basically releasing all the content for the next wave of material within a 1 month to 2 month span. So you could really just dive all in to the High Republic all at one point. I preferred that. And maybe we are a little bit biased from that perspective because we are completionists. We are reading everything for the channel. We're reading every other Star Wars book they're putting out. We're reading all of that type of stuff, right? So some people would prefer it sprinkled, because then they can slowly catch up as time goes on. They don't fall behind with a huge dump of content all at once. And I can understand that perspective. But for me, I found phase one and phase two's release strategy far more engrossing for the story because I'd get invested in a new plot point and just kind of go all in with all the media around it at once. And then after that investment, we'd wait a few months and then get invested in a new conflict. And I thought that worked far better for me with phase one and phase two than it did with phase three, because phase three is now going on 2 years in October. And it just felt like it. It felt really long. It started to feel a little more drawn out. Even in our viewership numbers for different High Republic things, we've noticed that people are slowly catching up with a lot of things that have come out in the last couple of years. And so it's just kind of, I think, dulled the excitement around new releases because there's just been so many more releases and they've been so much more spread out. Whereas instead of having to wait 6 months or 4 months for the next release, and then it kind of all happens at once and it's a major plot point, a lot of phase three felt like it was just being sprinkled. And some of the stuff in the middle of the story didn't feel nearly as important as the stuff at the beginning and the end. And so I thought that kind of dragged a little bit for me with phase three. But overall, I thought this was incredibly successful just purely because of the storytelling. I think there are a lot of technical issues with the structure, the way it was all drawn out, that I would definitely tighten up and change over the next publishing initiative or whatever they do next. But overall, I thought they worked really, really well for the way they told these stories. I think just for me, the big thing is just hone in your stories next time and really make sure that the YA and the junior novels and every other medium outside of adult novels is given that same care that the adult novels is given. And I think by doing so, by picking your set of characters, drawing out your stories before you start writing the novels, really outlining what you're going to do with those characters more so than with the plot. I think that would help a lot more because sometimes it just felt we were reading a random filler story that didn't really have anything to do with anything because there would be new characters that ultimately don't contribute really to the whole at all. So that would be my biggest negative. What do you guys think? What are your biggest positives and biggest negatives with the way the High Republic was structured? Did you like the phases? Did you like the way it was all set up? What are your thoughts on the way all of that shook out? We have some comments here from Rebel Sith 18, who has a few comments about Trials of the Jedi. And I think that's what we should move into next because we have some Trials of the Jedi spoiler talk to have here tonight. And I think there's a lot of obviously plot heavy things we can discuss, and that'll be a fun discussion to have for those people who've been itching to hear our spoiler thoughts. And Rebel Sith 18 starts it out with, what do you think of Aslan and Reith going forward? Who is the Sith Lord at this time? How could they connect? Reith and Aslan were always my favorites, and this was the perfect end for them for me. And then says, I did some math on who the Sith are and how they would fit into 28 BBY, which is 196 years before the Phantom Menace. Based on the Sith in the Plagueis novel, I estimate Plagueis became Tenebrous' apprentice about 135 BBY, 135 years before the Phantom Menace. Tenebris killed his Twi'lek master, Darth Ramage, and then around 160 years before the Phantom Menace, so I'm guessing around 228 BBY, Ramage would be the Sith Lord. Maybe before finding Tenebris, he takes on Aslan or Reeth. Wow, that would be a big turn for Reeth. I don't see that for Reeth personally. I don't see Reeth becoming a Sith. I don't see him falling to the dark side. I think he's conquered those demons personally, but I like the idea of Aslan being kind of one of those people who brings maybe a little bit of that darkness back to the forefront. You have somebody who's actively a dark side user, as we see in Into the Light, and then further in Trials of the Jedi, actively knows some superior dark side techniques with immense feats of force lightning and stuff like that in those books. So he is very, very powerful. And I wonder how, as word of his powers gets around, as he becomes less of a shut in and more outgoing, I guess, whatever his role is in life now in the future. I wonder if that attracts the Sith to him as, seeing him as a rival, somebody they have to take down. I think that would be a fascinating story for the future. But I don't know if I'd want to see Reeth turn. I feel like Reeth has grown. He's one of the few characters from that YA side that to me had a great arc and really grew into himself. And even in those moments where he's doubting himself, he really became somebody who was convicted and powerful in his own ways. And I really liked what they did with him, but I wouldn't mind him being a part of that conflict. I wouldn't mind him getting killed by the Sith or by that conflict with Aslan, but I don't know if I want to see him turn to the dark side itself.
Yeah, it's a tough one because a lot of, like, everything with the Rot of the Ages, I mean, that's really a big part of everything going on with Tears of the Nameless for Wreath and what they're understanding about just the material that's used for, like, the Jedi Nine's armor and all that. It's like, yeah, okay, I understand how much Reed has, like, chased knowledge, how he's become so important, and unfortunately almost become, like, a caretaker for Aslan, all the way up into Trials of the Jedi. I mean, even though he doesn't really have a huge role or anything on Kashyyyk and Into the Light, it's no, it's still a pretty important dynamic for the both of them, and there is, like, a big part of, like, Aslan feels like, "Oh, the Call of the Light's fully, like, cleansed me there." Uh, okay. Sorry about that. Hopefully you guys can hear us here pretty soon. Wow. Let's see. Just that. Okay. Hopefully it's come back a bit. Um, Sorry about that. Some internet issues have been happening in my area, so doesn't seem like it's improved too much, but we're gonna try our best here. See, hopefully it remedies itself. Um, But yeah, I guess to my whole point with everything that we've seen with Aslan Into the Light, he seems like he's taking a huge turn for the positive, but then what we see with everything that's going on in Trials of the Jedi, his whole line of York, like I've forgotten more than you'll ever learn in your whole lifetime, like, you see him just continuously with just everything going on the nameless planet, just how he just succumbs, he succumbs, he succumbs. Fear just dries him. He can't even hold on to that memory, and again, some of that kinda just does come down to, like, hey, you are telling, this very, very intricate multimedia initiative, like Liam was saying, there is author ownership that definitely does play a role into how much these characters are actually drawing from other authors' stories. But yeah, I mean, I think for sure Aslan is gonna be enticing for Reed. Reed, for the most part, is trying to chase him down and see what he can do because he wants to learn, but also because he's like, I don't want to give up on this dude. But Aslan's whole thing is like he's on Barnabas's ship, takes that dude's lightsaber out, and then turns the crystal red, right? And once you kind of do that, so far that we've seen in canon, once you bleed a crystal, you don't necessarily unbleed it, right? Like I think once you make that, that's like a huge step. That is a commitment. Now you're no longer like locked in on, becoming a Jedi again or like, "Oh, like, I have this crises of faith." Like, no, you've taken that step. It's almost like you crossed threshold there. So, he could be a Sith. Reed, I think, is gonna have a little bit more ambiguity, and I think that'd be good for his character, especially because he did have quite a bit with Trials of the Jedi, how much he's trying to, like, hold Aslan back from himself, but I was also taking Ties and all these other Jedis, like, advice very clearly, like, "We need to, like, dispose of him, we need to kill him, he's clearly gone crazy, he's harming the mission," and all that. It's a tough one. I could see Aslan be part of, like, the Bay Knight Sith, but the way he's gone about it, I don't know if I would want him to be, right? I'd almost like the Bay Knight Sith to be separate. We've seen from, like, the Acolyte visual guide, which, you don't have to love the show, but eventually we're gonna have to kind of, like, deal with Chimera and his whole story, like, why is he, some sort of Sith pretender or whatnot? And a big thing there for me is that I found pretty interesting is that apparently the visual guide has been saying like, "Hey, he may not really be part of, like, the Bay Knight Sit. He might still be on, the planet that's in the Plagueis novel, Aldemic, that, like, where you can harvest all the cortosis and everything." But he could just be, like, just following, his gut instincts or finding someone a breakaway sits and knowledge or, like, been seduced by somebody else or seen some crazy visions and kinda gotten himself into the path of, like, "Oh, I am that Sith," right? And I could see Aslan very much in the same thing, if not being the precursor to someone like Chimera, like, this is, like, he's able to seduce, attract, like, give these people what they want, and we know he's got that voice in his head throughout much of Trials of the Jedi once he's kinda overwhelmed by the planet and the Nameless. Is that his voice? Is that a future voice? Is that a Sith's voice? We don't know, right? He might have been seduced by a Bayonet Sith. I kinda don't want it to be. I kinda want it to be, like, just the darkest version of him just, like, fully, like, taking over his, personality being split or whatever. But, it's to be determined. I think Aslan could be a Sith. I'd prefer Breakaway for him. Reed, not necessarily, but I could see him, like, almost, be lost in this travel and this journey to, get back Aslan, and, he may not go down in the history books as, like, this incredible Jedi past everything in these phases 1 to and 3 of the High Republic because chasing Aslan is gonna be so consuming, the knowledge that he's gonna gain and all that will be wonderful, but is it gonna be more important to learn all this knowledge and go back to the Jedi or, like, to stop Aslan in his tracks? And, I mean, Aslan is, again, from what we've seen in Trials of the Jedi, much more powerful than Reeth is. Reeth is not bad by any means, but he's definitely more of a knowledge seeker than he is, like, a martial artist or, like, this telekinesis god or anything. So, I think one thing that has been very interesting about how they've written Reeth is, like, we don't really know, like, the greatest extent of his powers. Versus Aslan, where we see him once he's introduced in Phase 3 and everything that we've seen from the Edge of Balance precedent book, he has some incredible force powers, right? He has lived for so long, he's still able to move so incredibly and just walk around on Planet X, just exploding life around him and all. Is Reeth gonna even be able to handle that if he when he finally catches up to him? Would that be enough for him to be seduced because he gets defeated? Does Aslan even care at that point? I don't know, because still, at the end of the day, Aslan still does do the right thing for, the Nameless and with the Rod of Ages. It's just right after that, he goes and is like, "Yeah, I've fallen. What's stopping me now? Let me just listen to all the voices in my head." So, Sith, sure, I can see where your timeline is lining up, like, fairly well, but I kinda like the idea of all these Darksiders and, like, their own culture of sorts, like influencing each other and shaping each other in different like attempts towards reaching what ultimately is the success of the Bay Knight Sit.
Well, and again, the one thing I've always thought is that you can't really destroy an idea or a religion completely. You can't like wipe it off the map, right? So it's gonna be there. There will be texts about the Sith. There will be things out there about the Sith that you can follow and be a part of without ever being part of the actual Bay Knight lineage. So it's something to play with. I just like Aslan kind of as this in between. He doesn't want to be a dark sider, but he has become one, and he's been dominated by that life for so long that he's just kind of consumed by it, and he's still able and willing to do good things. He's able and willing to follow his heart and the good things about the Jedi, the light, but he can't stay on that path for a long time. He eventually cracks and reverts back to who he has become and the fear around that. And with the nameless now dead, though, he has the or not dead, but not a part of the galaxy anymore. He has the ability to really kind of rediscover himself. I would love to see him and his next story kind of be something where he goes off on his own kind of journey of discovery and discovers a lot about maybe the ancient Sith and sets up some of our little bit of our old Republic stuff and canons, discovers some Sith holocron or something, discovers some Sith teachings. We see how it plays off of him. I don't really want to see him become a true Sith Lord. I just don't think it fits him, because I think he is such a good character, a good in between. Like he works really well as this kind of odd, mixed moral, like heart's in the right place, but kind of addicted to the dark side, addicted to the fear and anger that he's always put himself under for years, and he keeps going back to those tendencies. And so I'm interested to see where that leads him. We also just kind of have the idea, right, that he's hundreds and hundreds of years old. So how much longer is he actually going to live? Like he's been feasting on this hatred and this fear and this anger, this dark energies kept him alive, but he's now that he doesn't have as something to fight, what how much longer does he actually live? Because I think he could be a character that you just write off as somebody who dies fairly quickly after this, or he could be somebody who actually plays an important role in the buildup of the dark side into the prequels. So I think that's something to definitely explore. Out of any of the characters that are left out of Trials of the Jedi, that is by far to me the most interesting story left to tell is the Aslan Wreath dynamic. Everybody else is wrapped up fairly neatly. I mean, I'm excited to maybe read another story 2, 3 years down the line with Bell doing something or Buryaga doing something, but we all know that it's not going to be that important because this is the big conflict. This wrapped up the story. It's over. And now we're leading into the next thing, which is going to be the Acolyte buildup. And so I think the Aslan stuff is really the place where you can harvest the most rich material that might actually build and connect to the larger canon. And so that's where I would hope they go in the future. Rebel Sith says, "What stories do you think they'll tell in this supposed phase more?" And I think that's going to be the ultimate question. I feel like personally, just for me, I feel like it's going to be a lot of like unsatisfying epilogue type storytelling. Like I just don't see it being some big new interconnected phase. I see it kind of being a lot of one-off stories, maybe a duology or a trilogy around one set of characters or one character. I don't see it being this big like phase long thing. There will be some aftermath of the Nile. There'll be, Nile insurgent groups and on different planets, and maybe the Jedi are sent to have to put them down. Maybe there's an outpost that's attacked by the remnants of the Nile who have all formed up around the image of the eye and all this stuff. Like I think stuff like that where you have maybe a 20 years on and you have older Bells that afar going back and doing something like that. I feel like those types of stories are the ones on the table. And while they can be good individual stories, they're definitely not going to live up to the overall hype level that has been here with this grander initiative. But I think the things that really could be interesting are the stories they tell around Reef and Aslan. Those will be the things that are most interesting. And I think their big focus too was probably going to be trying to connect further the Acolytes and the High Republic. But now that the Acolyte's gone, what do they do with that bridge? Do they say, okay, now let's double down on the High Republic isms of this time period and really try to expand the High Republic into the Acolyte era and kind of let the High Republic take over the Acolyte time period? Or do they say, no, let's just take the Acolyte stories that we were going to tell in the future and now make that the centerpiece of our next phase of High Republic storytelling? I could see that going either way as well. But I do think that the next stories we get will probably be like Nile remnant stuff, and random Jedi X goes and fights Nile remnant with a new Padawan who, wasn't around during the Nile conflict, and now they have, some beef, but they grow to be, good teammates, and you start to see some of the fractures and the changes in the Jedi that starts to become a little bit more like who they are in the Acolyte and who they are in the prequels. That's going to be kind of the focus of stories moving forward, is really tying it into those more broken Jedi, the Jedi you see towards the end of this novel, and moving into the next phase of Star Wars prequel era storytelling.
Yeah, yeah. It's a little tough because, this phase more is more of like an open-ended idea for them. We know there's rumors of like some of the authors that got introduced older from back in phase one. Definitely stuff going in like phase three, especially like George Mann and all these guys, right? When they really kind of came in, stepped up to the plate. Uh, a couple of them we know are gonna be at San Diego Comic Con this summer, I believe. So that's when we're gonna get our first real information about it. It is pretty clear that, like, just even reading, like, the thank yous from Charles Soule at the end of Trials of the Jedi, it's like they were dying from phase 1. That was an incredibly well planned out, you know, uh, idea as a concept. They were championed from top to bottom, from Kathleen Kennedy all the way down to just their writer's room. But it is a lot to do that. Like, they were talking about how, like, yeah, phase 1 already broke them. That's why we needed those new authors in phase 2 and phase 3 to almost rebalance the scales, right? And it's not like this was just a bunch of new authors. Like, I can understand Charles Soule because his background was in comics, right? You still have people like Justina Ireland, who's done other Star Wars books. You've had, someone who's considered basically right now, like, the canon, Star Wars GOAT and Claudia Gray. She showed up and wrote Fallen Stars, she wrote Into the Dark, Into the Light, she wrote Quest of the Jedi one-off, a comic, right? Like, she is someone I didn't expect to, like, necessarily just be average. Like, I still thought she had some good stories to tell, and, again, a lot of it does come down to, like Liam pointed out, the YA novels sometimes were either super important or absolutely not important, and it was just very uneven, very much who the author was. And then you're like, "Oh, okay, like, that's fine. I understand why that's happening, for sure." But then what's gonna go on moving forward with some of these characters and their stories? Like, if they were already so heavily weighed down by just how much the effort was for this, and the execution is where, a lot of our criticism comes down to, right? They finally addressed the whole planning around Star Wars thing. But execution also matters as much as that. So what is phase one really gonna look like? Is that gonna be just an idea that's, like, spread out for, like, 10 years? Is that gonna be something that they're gonna be very like, "Hey, we get all this stuff wrapped up here." How much are they waiting on the Acolyte and their plan season 2 and those storylines to, be reintegrated and set up between everything left in the High Republic? I mean, a big thing that we have to know, and it's not just the acolyte stuff, like, we have to know at some point the Jedi are gonna kinda slip more towards this dogmatic order. Trials of the Jedi does not really leave them there. They're very happy, they have their celebrations, they're at peace, they know they've been changed, not to what extent they don't know at that point, that's fine. But we also know, like, the Guardian protocols and everything was, like, removed again, right? So why wouldn't they go back to just designing their beautiful lightsabers and all that? Sure, Trade Federation might have some new technology, but they're not gonna be the Trade Federation of the prequels yet, right? Like, there's still a lot of time, and is this just something that they're gonna just let these authors still kinda have ownership and kinda do their duologies, their trilogies? Are they gonna try to have some sort of, like, plan to the Acolyte? Do they even want to? Or is phase more frankly just like Liam said, is it just like epilogues? Is it just wrapping up stuff? Is it gonna be like, "Hey, Reed's whole story with Aslan's gonna happen now," but then we know Avon is officially dead, right? That's how she's gone under the Sunveil name or something, and she's not to be found by Gira, who's won everything else in her political arena, but now won't have the love of her daughter who's run away, and we know that Avon at some point her and Vanessa catch up because that's what Wayseeker really implies, that she and her family live a very different part of the galaxy that only a few people know about. Is that a story that's gonna be addressed by Justina Ireland? The way she's talked about it in her most recent interviews, it seems like she's done entirely with Star Wars for the time being, like, she's taking a major break from the franchise. and who could blame her? She was one of the most prolific authors throughout the High Republic. So I don't know. I don't know what phase more really means. It feels more like an idea that they're gonna, maybe present some cool concepts for, but that doesn't feel like for an example, like a Clone Wars Legacy when they're like, "Yeah, okay, some of this stuff is getting adapted to a comic book. Some of this is gonna be just released as animatic. Some of this is being turned into a book, right? Here's the plan, 2, 3 years." Stuff changed after that, but they still figured out this is our plan of, like, how we're gonna get these stories out. I don't know if there's really a plan yet for the High Republic. I think they're just like, we're gonna see how people react, how people catch up, frankly, to Phase 3, how sales are looking like with all the books, and then from there, you know, we'll decide what it's gotta look like. I think the Acolyte is obviously gonna be something that's gonna be very difficult to, like, work around now with it being canceled. No matter what, all these storylines, at some point, we're gonna have to lead into it. But now that we don't have a season 2, how are you gonna prioritize all the stuff that season 2 would've had leading into the prequels first, and then, just give a little bit of this, a little bit of that for the High Republic, finish that stuff, and then come back? Is it both at the same time? There's always a big question with Star Wars fans, can you balance the eras? And I think book fans in general are a lot better, but High Republic's not just books, it's not just adult novels, it's a lot of different storytelling mediums. Is that gonna be something that they wanna continue, like, having comics? I mean, we're not even mentioning how, like, at the end of the Blade of Bardotta miniseries for Porter Engle, Charles Soule's like, "Yeah, I got another miniseries lined up." And then nowadays, he's like, "I'm not even sure if I'm ready to start working on it, and where does that even fit in the timeline?" There's so many questions to be asked. The way Charles has ended with his character, you don't even need that per se. So it's like, what is Phase more? I think it's really just an idea, and they just wanna talk about High Republic, have a retrospective, and maybe be like, "Yeah, I'm working on a book," but I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, I don't think they have concrete plans, and I think it would be smarter to just wait a few years at least,
Yeah,
let this die down, let this settle. People are obviously still catching up. Phase 3 had more content than any of the phases prior, even though it was more spread out, it still had so much content if you're trying to read everything. Plus, you've got like Audible originals, you got two Audible originals added to this. Like, there's so much in phase 3 that if you weren't keeping up as it was coming out, I mean, you're just buried with content. So I think it's smarter to wait a few years, let the whole thing kind of sink in. I think originally the idea was to have the Acolyte kind of just be ideally this huge success that would prompt outside people who aren't reading the High Republic to dive into the High Republic, and then simultaneously the end of the High Republic would happen right after. Then it would boost the Acolyte even further into its season 2 as it continued to really grow and change and thrive, right? And I think that was really the idea, but it kind of feels like the Acolyte almost killed a little bit of the enthusiasm, not really from the general audience around the High Republic, but just kind of from within the creators, from like within Disney, from within just everybody around. Like, it doesn't seem like the High Republics had that same gigantic push, excitement, love that was there, that passion that was there prior to the Acolyte. It just feels like everybody's like, okay, we got to get this, we're going to finish it, and then now that it's over, it just feels like this kind of sigh of relief. And that's just the way I felt about a lot of the things coming out in the last few years around the High Republic is you have the gems, like Trials of the Jedi is great. Tears of the Nameless is great, but in a lot of ways it feels like a lot of content that's kind of dumped out there unceremoniously. And I don't know if it feels like that's more so coming from just a little bit lack of enthusiasm, at least compared to phase one, and maybe the beginning of phase two or beginning of phase three, especially. But phase one, phase three, beginning of phase three, there was so much enthusiasm there from publishing itself, and now it's just kind of like, okay, it's ending, and here you go, and it doesn't feel like there's that same enthusiasm even from the creatives around it right now. So I think everybody needs kind of a break. Although it was extremely exciting for all of us to read, and it was a fantastic book, I think everybody's ready to check out some other things, fill in some gaps, talk a lot about 2020 two, but we had that kind of nice little period between March of 2022 where the High Republic pretty much completely wrapped up phase one, and then October of 2022 where you had this like 6 month or so gap, 6, 7 month gap where there was no High Republic, and Star Wars just went back to telling other random stories. You had the Padawan book, you had Shadows of the Sith, you had Brotherhood, you had Princess and the Scoundrel, you had all these different new Star Wars projects jumping back and kind of bringing back some importance to the main characters of Star Wars. And it was kind of this nice, refreshing little period before you started phase two. And we never got that between phase two and phase three. Phase two ended in June of 2023, and then phase three started in October again. So it was like 3 months or so of no High Republic content and then jumping right back into phase three. And it just kind of made, I think, the whole thing kind of stretch out a little bit longer than maybe they were intending, and especially with the content drops in phase three. So it seems like everybody needs a little bit of a break. I think with phase four, they will bring more back, but I don't know if it's truly going to be a phase. I think it's just going to be like, hey, you guys, remember the High Republic? Y'all loved that. Here's a new book starring Bell. Here's a new book starring Reith and Aslan. Here's a new book starring Ty Yorick. And I think we're going to start randomly getting little drops, but it won't be nearly as structured as it is now. Um, and Fabricio says the High Republic is definitely one of my favorite Star Wars projects, one of the best Star Wars projects ever. So happy to have lived it. Yeah, I mean, it's a great time to be a Star Wars fan, and in publishing, it's such a unique initiative. And even though I think we were a little bit burned out by the time it was over, it was still such a fun ride. And I personally really look back on this whole thing fondly just because it kickstarted the channel. I mean, I started the YouTube side. We used to be podcasts only, and I started the YouTube side because we were like, well, I might as well try the book reviews we were doing on podcasts for Light of the Jedi and Into the Dark. Let's just try it on YouTube, see how many views it gets. So it really does coincide with the birth and surge of our channel. We've been with the High Republic the entire way, and it's been a lot of fun covering this whole thing. So gonna a few years down the road, once we're settled and away from the High Republic for a little bit, there's going to be a lot of nostalgia and like really just fun times to think back on where we were, especially as fans and as a channel here, with different releases, and seeing, oh, that's the type of content we were making then, or that's the type of discussions we were having around Star Wars then. It really has tracked basically the entirety of the Disney Plus Star Wars era and the ups and downs we've had through that as well. So it's been a real fun time capsule, and I think something we're going to look back on very fondly, even if certainly I'm ready to move on to some other stories right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, I think we've been talking about it so much with just how spread out phase 3 ended up being, but we were like, if we came out like how phase 1 did, yeah, maybe probably would have been overwhelming, and maybe we're just a bit burnt out compared to back then. But I mean, a lot of it is great quality content. Yeah, a lot of it was great quality content all around, right? And we were begging as canon junkies, like, "Hey, we need to finally have, like, big storytelling." That was the promise of 2015. That's the expectation after seeing how many different big series are there in Legends, and that's still something I think absolutely we both agree canon needs to have more of those. If you're obviously, with the Disney money, you're gonna kinda prioritize animation, the visual side of it, maybe tell that as, like, your baseline, and then doing live action shows and movies again. They're still also changing there too, right? Like, this kinda came in this nice little period where you like, they almost probably saw, like, the bubble is exploding for streaming right now. Let's just throw everything into books. It's a lot cheaper, but we can experiment a lot more here and, deal with characters, their sort of relationships and everything, the galaxy as a whole, just some of these ideas about, like, a whole new unexplored era in any part of Star Wars history, and let's see what we can make out of it. And I think they like you said, Fabrizio, I think it was incredible to live through it. It was. It's just if phase 3 was a little bit more sped up, I think we would have been a lot more excited for it because there was some great storytelling in phase 3. I mean, we had I think we did a tier list for just canon authors in general, but High Republic authors, like, yeah, George Mann, he saved a lot of Phase 3 for us, like, you could tell a lot of these authors before, like, obviously Charles Soule finishes off this whole thing, they were tired, there's a lot of structure to it, there's a lot of planning and coordination, and, that doesn't necessarily line up with the art of creative writing, right? Like, even if it is franchise-based, these are still people who wanna tell their own stories with their characters and all that, and with how many stories are being told concurrently, they probably were like, "What do you mean? There's, like, more than 500 notes now? Now there's 5,000 because I have to care about this one comic that Kevin Scott's doing," and that guy just pumps out the comics like crazy too, right? And it was kinda sad not seeing him really have a role at all in Phase 3, right? Like, there's also that sense of familiarity that was gone, and because of that Phase 2 gap, you're like, "Oh, kinda wanna see everybody who was there in Phase 1 and almost adjust to that again in their writing styles and all that." So, it's something that we never really had to deal with Legends because anytime they did any sort of visual connection or piece to it, it'd be kinda after you finish that era arc, like, it'd be that, and then you might write some stories around it, and you kinda have to force fit it. So, this is the first time they've ever just tried everything all at once that is in a print format, and I think it worked for the most part. It was just a lot. If they had maybe, like, pulled back a little bit on, like, the kids' comics, if they had, maybe dropped one less junior novel or just kept the crew of the junior novels all the same throughout each phase, if the young adult novel characters actually got to jump in between and have some of their stories be like subplots of the adult novels, I think we'd look at this as a fantastic, like, incredible achievement. Right now, we can say, "No, I thought it was really good." It just there were things I have to be fair about the criticisms of. So and I think that's how it's always been with Star Wars. It's just it just I wish we were still there back at Celebration 2022 when everybody's cheering and the excitement of that. I don't think that's there right now for the High Republic. I think a lot of people are just tired. Some people might have even dropped it after Phase 1 because they just don't have the time for it now. So, moving forward, hopefully, they kinda go for something that's a little bit more contained, a little bit more precise about what they're doing, and we don't have to deal with, like, 700 characters, right? Especially if you're gonna be writing a lot of them in more kid-friendly formats.
Well, yeah, and I think that's we'll talk about other publishing initiatives in a little bit, but I think that's a big one for other publishing initiatives is that most of the time they still focused on the main set of characters you had in Star Wars. They didn't really expand, and if they did, it was on the villain side. This is one of the very few publishing initiatives that's completely created new characters. Like the only characters we knew before this are some of the legacy Jedi Council members, and almost none of them have big roles in these stories outside of really Yaddle in Cataclysm. There's nobody else who has a gigantic role in these stories. So we really were this was really an ambitious project from start to finish because even in something like New Jedi Order, you have new villains, you have whole new factions and new worlds around that, but the characters are still the ones you had been reading for 10 years prior to that. So there's a familiarity there. And I think that's something that definitely was exciting at the beginning because you wanted to know everybody in the High Republic. You wanted to learn all these characters. You want to learn what each one of them did. They did such a great job of making the Jedi so unique and individualized that it felt really cool learning about how each one saw the Force or how each Jedi was able to bring something to the Jedi Order as a whole. Whereas in the prequels, there's so much more of a unit. There's so much more dogmatic. There's so much more just they're less individualized, more communalized, and like this was really interesting to see everybody so different. But then in doing so, it's like they went overboard on like how many different types of Jedi can we make and how
Yeah.
many are you going to have to remember? And then also, are you going to have to remember all these other random characters from other factions that aren't the Jedi around the galaxy? And then this person's going to be in one book and then they won't appear for another 3 years. And it's just like that became too much ultimately. And I think that disserviced a lot of characters who could have had better stories. And then it also just made half of them feel super forgettable. So I think that's definitely on one of the cons as well of this whole structure of the High Republic. But let's dive into some of the spoilers on Trials of the Jedi as well, because we want to talk about some of the things that we really loved in that book, and we did talk about Reith and Aslan a little bit. But let's pick a few characters to talk about here. Also, on top of that, as well as some of the major plot points, because we've been waiting for weeks to talk about Trials of the Jedi and the way this whole thing ended. And starting off, I think we should start off with the two big things, the two things that kind of dominated adult novels over the entirety of their run in Phase 1 and Phase 3. And let's start with the first one, which is Avar Chris and Elzar Mann, their relationship, the way it's changed from Light of the Jedi to then being kind of dropped from the end of Phase 1, then to being kind of these star-crossed lovers who were their anchor points from beyond the storm wall and within the storm wall to try to, help each other find a way back to each other, these kind of soulmates who eventually find their way back. And then the progression of the relationship and like reaffirmation of it and temptation of the force. And then now in trials, we really see what the purpose of that was. And I think that's one of the big things for me that trials nailed was the fact that these two aren't just lovers. They're not just Jedi who fell in love, and they're not just such great Jedi that they can put aside their passions and their attachments and be this cohesive union. And even though I thought Temptation of the Force did a good job of kind of like from a certain point of view explaining away why these two could be together versus other Jedi being together, it still felt a little weird just with all the stuff we know about Jedi relationships, right? Then you have Trials of the Jedi, and you see the way they end this light and darkness holding the blight at bay, basically doomed to an eternity of this job, but being two halves of the same whole, united and unified, stopping the blight. One, it made me actually like the blight a little bit more, which I really was not a fan of the blight for the majority of phase three. I just thought it was kind of underwhelming until this book, but it made me like the blight a lot more. But two, it just made their relationship so much more impactful because it feels like there was a purpose to it in the Force. Now there is a specific spiritual reason these two were brought together rather than they just liked each other and they decided to hook up. So I thought that was something that really kind of saved one of the plot lines that was extremely well written, but just always kind of weird in the sense that like Star Wars and Jedi, we don't do that really in the prequel era, the post Old Republic era. There's just no real relationships. And then now you bring that in and do it incredibly well. I thought that was one of the best things they did in Trials of the Jedi. But what were your thoughts overall, Sonic, on Avar and Elzar across the entire High Republic and the way Charles Soule wrapped them up here in Phase Three?
I mean, they got their due justice, like you said, in phase 3, as someone who read everything in phase 1, like, almost, like, day of releases, like, I could live with what's going on with Avar in the comics, and it's very important to her character, but then I was frustrated by Claudia Gray not really addressing a lot of that. Like, there is some stuff with her and Stellan, right, like, and how he reacts to her, he's like, "I'm gonna be the marshal now," like, you can't just abandon your post, like, this is what you were supposed to be, the beacon of hope, the hero of Hetzal, right? Like, you're the song of the Jedi and the Force, and everybody was gonna be connected to you and all that, like, what is this? Yeah, you're having, like, a moody, like, side plot? Okay. So did Elzar, but he did that in the books, buddy, like, what's going on with you, right? So, I still
Yeah,
think that's one of their biggest flaws as a whole because if Claudia Gray had at least given her some tertiary perspective in Fallen Star and in that way informed us about, like, what it would look like from the outside coming into the Starlight Beacon and everything happening on their half of the station, I think that would have been huge. I think that would have been huge for the characters, and then, even if we don't call it perfect, it would have been like, but I know what has to happen. We can take Elzar and that dynamic that he has with Stellan and how Stellan helps him through that. We can see how, like, once that his death high becomes so much necessary to have these 2 have their perspectives collide once more, like there was at the very beginning of Phase 1 in Light of the Jedi. It just just it never made any sense for that to be a choice. I think that I don't know if it was Claudia, I don't know if it was just a story group, I don't know if it's just the Starlight, group of people, right, like, or Luminous group, Project Luminous people who were, like, disagreeing on how exactly Fallen Star should address it, but that always bummed me out. But thanks to George Mann and thanks to, like, Shadows of the Starlight comic miniseries and all that, like, we got all of that stuff in full, and by the time we get to Trials of the Jedi, yes, you don't have to love Temptation of the Force, it really is like a romance novel for them. That's kinda how it's written out. I was kind of glad about that because then it does allow for other people's, like, kinda discovery of it and, like, how they handle it in Trials of the Jedi, like Bell and Briaga, like, you're like, "Okay, at least all that stuff I can live with and not having to, when it repeats a little bit more at the beginning because 'cause you're like, "Yeah, it makes sense." Like, we're approaching the end of the era for them. They've had this connection. It's turned physical. It's turned into something more once more for them, if not anything great, if not more and greater. And then Trials of the Jedi, you're like, well, but the whole story is like, this is it. This is our last chance. This is we're going off with guess, like, returning the nameless will solve this, right? Like, it's not that's how desperate the Jedi are. So I was glad to see, like, okay, we got to still honor a lot what about these star-crossed lovers, how they got reconnected, what Elzar did to reach out to her, what Avar grew into after some of her darker, murkier periods that the comics definitely built out, but the books kinda only play around with until Eye of Darkness. So, once, you put them together and they're both on the mission immediately, it just there was a flow to it. It was really nice. It was well equipped, and seeing everybody else kinda catch up to them and their story, I was happy about that. Everything that happened on Planet X with them, I mean, Elzar's an idiot. He kinda jumps ahead of the gun, right? Like, he quite literally kills Chancey Yarrow and stops Starlight Beacon from being saved. But that becomes a huge part of, like, his ultimate character's realization of, like, "You know what? I have to be that balance point of the darkness. I can't hide from my darkness. If anything, Avar's helped me through so much of it. Now's the time for me to do the same for her, and she needs to be the light in the darkness," right? That whole it was almost like it wasn't a world between worlds for them, but, like, that little weird disc world place that the pure nameless kinda live in, that was fascinating. Because at the end of the day, it became about their choices. It became about, like, we have this incredible power, incredible abilities, blah, 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 but now we have to take our relationship to the next level, and that means to finally let go, right? Like, this is the whole thing that Yoda talks about. You can love freely. You can have all this. A Jedi is not stopped from loving, but you have to be willing to let go of your attachments, not be afraid of that. And they both proved that they could do that, right? And I think that's wonderful. It's nice to know that from teenagers, they were kind of in like a throuple with those two and, and Stellan Geos on and off until they matured, and then once all this conflict happens, and then these 2 are kinda brought together once more, they get to, experience everything like, you'd hope a normal person gets to, but then they're like, "At the end of the day, we're the Jedi. We do what's needed. We have to set aside what is necessary," and they do that, and there's a little bit more detail overall to, like, exactly how their dynamic will work, kinda being on Planet X, kinda how everything will be balanced out for them for the decades that they have to remain on the planet, seeing each other. I'd like a little bit more detail. We're never really gonna get story from them, this is it, but it's nice to see them quite literally be the yin and yang, right? Like, they found the balance within themselves, they found the balance in their relationship, they found the balance necessary for the whole galaxy, and which is awesome. That's what made this book really work for me because I was like, they're going with some really weird sci-fi esoteric elements that we kind of explored, like World Between Worlds and the Celestials and all that from Legends all the way to Clone Wars, where we are in current canon, but this was, like, a satisfying like, at the end of the day, it is about the people and their connection, their relationship, and what it means to be a Jedi, and I thought that was a great summation for both of their arcs. Just wish that was a little bit clearer in phase 1.
Yeah, definitely. But I think in phase three, it really, really did redeem him. I thought it was a fantastic end. So one of the best plot points for me in Trials of the Jedi, one that absolutely had to hit. I mean, not only because they're our main characters, but because just this plot point in particular seems so central to some of the things we see in the prequels, obviously with Anakin and the passion and his love with Padme to have a direct relationship here between Jedi as one of the focuses of the story, and it's very out there and open. At least there can now be some type of reason for it, like reason within the Force. And I thought that was something very, very compelling. Now let's talk about the other big thing that Phase 3 definitely struggled with, but I thought Charles Soule returning to a character he really loves to write in Markion Road did a great job of wrapping up. And that is Markion and the Nile. So, talking about the Blight and Rebel Sith, you're commenting on the Blight as well down there, saying you thought it was wrapped up well. I thought it was wrapped up well too. I've been on record since Defy the Storm that I just feel like this Blight thing was just uninteresting. I thought the Blight was something that just felt like, okay, we got to have some bigger villain beyond Markion because what can Markion really do if he's no longer like a surprise threat? Now he and the Nile are directly fighting the Jedi, how do they really stand up to the might of the Jedi Order, right? And it felt like they kind of decided, okay, let's do something that's just nobody can defeat. Like it's just an all-consuming thing that is impossible to defeat by any one faction. And in doing so, it just felt like it never really had character in its own. It was hard to really get attached or afraid of the blight because it was something you knew was going to get defeated eventually because it's not in the prequels, and something that just didn't have character to it. And I thought they started to develop it a little bit better in things like Tears Nameless and then Into the Light. I thought did a pretty good job with it. But Trials wrapped it up very, very well. And for me, one of the reasons I ended up liking the end of the Blight was because Markion was given more character. And Markion as
Yeah.
a whole, to me, was not given his due in phase three. I did not like how they handled Markion. I liked Eye of Darkness. I thought Eye of Darkness did a really good job with him. He was still brutal. He was still terrifying. The way he kills Pratri Veter in that beginning opening of Eye of Darkness was horrifying. And it was so Markion, and it felt like, okay, here's the next step for him. But at the same time, we also see him floundering a little bit in that book, trying to figure out what's next. He doesn't really care about ruling part of the galaxy. He wants the whole galaxy and he wants to just be chaotic and be himself. And that the way they tried to rein him in as this leader, you knew the character wasn't satisfied. And as a reader, I was never really satisfied with what else they did with Markion in the rest of phase three. After Eye of Darkness, it just felt like he just became this side character and somebody that we knew we'd get to eventually, but it just felt like they were like, we don't really want to deal with him until Trials of the Jedi, and that's it. But I do think it was worth the wait. I still am overall fairly negative on the way Markion Row was used throughout phase three and used in this phase three story. I would have much preferred some type of Nile versus Jedi plot. You could still incorporate the Nameless and the Blight and whatever in that story, but I just would have loved the Nile and that difference in ideology to still be at the forefront of the stories here. But Markion is used so well in Trials. I love his scene where he confronts all the Jedi. It's phenomenal. And Charles Soule knows how to write this character, whether it's the Eye of the Storm comic duology, two shot, if you want to call it that, whether it's Light of the Jedi, which I thought he did a fantastic job setting up this character. If the Rising Storm is maybe Markion's most evil book, the one where he gets to do the most stuff, it's because of Light of the Jedi that Rising Storm works so well with
Yeah.
Markion, because he's set up so well, because of his intellect and his machinations are set up so well in the Light of the Jedi, the way he deals with Kosov at the end of that book, all of it just works so well. And Charles Soule knows how to write this character so well that it absolutely, to me, saves Markion's journey from being one that's ultimately a complete disappointment, but I still would have loved to see him sprinkled throughout the initiative a bit more. But I loved the way he was wrapped up here. I loved his fights with the Jedi. I loved getting chapters from his perspective, the manicness of him, the way he just went kind of crazy in this final part of the book. And then his ultimate end, getting sent off on a prison and forgotten when all he's ever wanted to be was bigger than anything in the galaxy. He has very nihilistic thoughts in this story, and he's able to try to become this transcendent icon, and ultimately he falls by the wayside. It's just a little benchmark in history, a little bump in the road for the Jedi, and sent off, and now he's gone. And I thought it was very fitting conclusion for his character. I thought Charles Soule did a great job in this book of wrapping him up. But Sonic, what were your thoughts on Markion overall and the way he was used throughout phase one and phase three, and then obviously the way Trials?
Yeah, I mean, this was the book that I was expecting from him after The Rising Storm. Like, I liked him in that Eye of Darkness. I think I was quite positive on him in that book, but this one was a different step, right? Because he's insane. He's like and he's always been insane, right? And, like, that's always been part of his character, like, how he rose up, how, like, everyone was very unassuming about who he is. He's just like a little runt, and then you're like, "Wait a minute, he's got this crazy plan." Like, that's one of the things I actually loved about, like, Tempest Runner in general as an audio drama is, like, you see Lorna D. and everything that she's done and the killing that she's done to, like, rise up in her ranks, and then you see her perspective of, like, him rising up. She's a very intimidating character who's gone through very interesting transformation through both her audio dramas and the comic books. But seeing his transformation from, like, her perspective from when we know, especially in Phase 1, is so ruthless, and then how, like, insane he becomes, like, yeah, he was fascinating. I mean, this is the dude who he has so much structure, but he's not supposed to be anything other than the calm eye in the middle of it. That's the how the Nile was created. It's a storm, right? And then all of a sudden he takes control, and it's just insane to see, like, what comes next from him. I think what kinda became an issue for me is that I wish Gira Staros and him had more. I think it was really well done in this book. In the other books, it's more like they come and go. It's like, "Oh, Gira came out of his chambers after they slept together." It's like, "Okay, cool, you're adding some complexities to that character and, like, how he's, like, not just, like, intimidating because 'cause he's got the star maps and everything and how bloodthirsty his attitude is, but it's like, oh, he's a seductive man too. Like, great, that's fine. I like those. Those are some great details. It's just not the consistency that I was expecting, right? And I think that was some of my biggest issues, right? I was like, what's he doing there?" Right? Like, he's okay in Temptation of the Force, but that with that feel I felt like that was a big miss there too, like, after how solidly he starts to get in Eye of Darkness, he's like, "What's next?" He's kinda impatient with himself, he doesn't really know what's next, and Gear's kind of trying to figure out, like, "Oh, okay, we have to do this," and, like, create a little bit more formation here to, like, change the Nile into a little bit more of, like, everybody's plainclothes off, stuff like that, like, that's stuff that we kind of get, like, thrown in detail-wise here in this book that does play out really well with the Battle of Ariado and the structure of the Nile, but it just he got so disconnected from his organization by Phase 3 that, like, at least getting the psychology of his relationship with himself, what he's achieved, and his relationship with Kira, and that doesn't really happen as much until this book. So that was my biggest disappointment because the way it was written out here was fantastic. I think George Mann definitely set him up to at least you're, like, kinda worried about what comes next, even though he isn't doing too much there. But then by temptation, you're like, "Okay, he's kinda got something at the very end there," but it's still not crazy cool or super interesting, versus Phase 1, right? Light of the Jedi, Rising Storm, and then the culmination with Fallen Star, you're like, "Oh my god," like, he achieved it. And there's so much about his psychology, his characters that he was just like, "Okay, I did all that, but, like, I'm not gonna be iconic, right? Like, I don't get to have this everlasting victory, like, this is not." It's kinda like the questions that we have around Balin, like, what is Balin gonna try to do to break his own cycle, right? Is that mean for Ahsoka Season 2? I don't know, but, like, the fact that the Nihil name actually has some value and meaning, like, this guy went so nihilistic, he's like, "There's no way I can be happy until everything doesn't exist anymore because that's the only way that can be absolute and that I've won." Like, insane, truly genuinely insane, and I love the writing around him in this book. I just didn't understand why he would take so out of Phase 3. I don't know if it's simply the spacing of the books, but yeah, it just kinda felt like yeah, like, a lot of the middle of Phase 3, he was just kinda out and about, just pulling and pushing and prodding, like, even that whole relationship that he has with General Vise, she's I don't know, it seemed like there was supposed to be way more about that, but I don't really recall too much, like, the he's like he even talks about it, he's like, "I let Bulin do his thing, I let Beast do his thing, I let everyone kinda just have fun," right? But, no, I know exactly what I've been trying to do this whole time, it's like, "Are you sure about that, buddy? Because like, we didn't really get any POV of you. We didn't get into your head as much as we did in Phase 1." So that was my biggest criticism of that, but the way he's handled Trials of Jedi is just fantastic. I mean, the way he treats the Nameless, the way he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna fight you, Bell. I think you remember this lightsaber." Like, it's just he is vicious, he's cruel, he's calculating. I mean, the dude and you can see that he's, like, kind of breaking down a little bit too, but not so much from, like, the visions of, like, his ancestors that, like, how, like, everything was kinda hinted at the end of Phase 1 and the beginning of Phase 3, but more just, like, just deep dissatisfaction with, like, what he achieved, right? What everybody else is like, "You've done such something major and insane, but you gotta hold it." And again, that's where that relationship with Gira, I think, should have been a lot more fleshed out. He's like, "That doesn't mean anything to me. I need this to be get, like, joy out of it." Like, the dude is laughing knowing, like, "Oh my god, like, the blight's gonna get accelerate every time I kill a Nameless and drive them off the cliff." And then immediately he's like, "Oh, I hate this. I hate that I don't know the exact details of how much the blight is gonna spread on this planet or which planet comes next." It's like truly a psychotic creature by this book, and it was just fascinating to see him play out that way. And that final chapter with him, I was a big fan of. I was like, "Yeah, it's just there's nothing there. There's nothing to care about. There's nothing for him there." The man gets so depressed that he's like, "Oh my god, I accidentally destroyed one of my droids while I was trying to, like, escape out of here," and he had his own, like, little Wilson moment, right, from Castaway. He's like, "Oh no, I've lost my friend, this droid that I'm stuck on an asteroid with. How will I ever, like, fully recover?" Right? It's like, yeah, it is pathetic. It is sad. I just wish some of that patheticness, the sadness, and all that was just a little bit more developed. Even Tempest Breaker tried a little bit as an audio drama, but it was like, you're not getting to the true psychology of this guy. Like, everybody is drawing blanks on him for so much of Phase 3. But I'm like, "Well, okay, everybody else can do that. Let us at least get a better, closer hint of that instead of just some of his actions." That's the thing that I really missed that Phase 1 really balanced. Like, he's doing these things, but he's also thinking these things, and we get to see both. And sometimes the characters might know one, sometimes the characters might know another, but it was never really balanced the same way again in Phase 3.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm very much so in agreement with that. Like the balance was completely missing for Markion, and it just felt like he was just set up all for the end. It was like all at once, here's your Markion that you remember. And we even had been kind of complaining about this since the Fallen Star, because the Fallen Star, he's the guy sitting back watching the events happening. He orchestrated them, yes, but he's kind of not a part of the book the way he is in Light of the Jedi and the Rising Storm. He's sitting back there with his fingers together, in his chair, going, "Okay, yes, my plan is unfolding." Like he's not doing anything. And I think he was so good, and maybe unintentionally so. Like maybe they didn't mean to create what was starting to become one of our favorite Star Wars villains of the last 10-15 years, but they did in Light of the Jedi and the Rising Storm. And then they kind of just said, well, now what do we do with him now that he's kind of reached the peak of his potential? What do we do with him? He's kind of just doesn't know what to do with himself, so we don't know what to do with him. And that's I mean, that it's on its face, that can be an idea that maybe in a long form TV show or in real life is something that can work. But in a medium like this, where you're itching to see what happens every single book that comes out, you don't want one of your most interesting characters to just be sitting on his hands doing nothing. And so that felt underwhelming, but I'm glad Charles Soule was able to resurrect it a bit, resurrect that fear and that just fervor from Markion that was in the first two books of the books. Really, to me, stood on the back of the fact that they had extremely compelling villains. When you remove Markion, the series as a whole doesn't have any other villains that really rise up to his level, and especially in phase one and phase two. And so that ultimately kind of felt like missing a big chunk of the core of what we fell in love with from the High Republic. And so I'm glad that they brought that back. Rebel Sith says, where did you first comment? Sorry about Markion. Markion was had a perfect ending, and I thought the night was. I thought the it was Oh, the Blight, and I thought the Blight was a last minute bigger villain add on at first too, but they saved my view on it for sure in this end. Also didn't realize the Blight was actually mentioned first in the end of phase 2 in Path of Vengeance, with the whole thing with the underdwellers, and that the dude that could use the Force, Marta Rowe's boyfriend, I think had a vision about it, Blight upon the lands. So that made me feel a little bit better about knowing that it was planned out, at least from phase 2. But yes, they wrapped it up very well. And then also said, George Man, let me see, where did you talk about Markion here? Eye of Darkness was great too, but it dragged out way too far, and Markion just became a lazy bum. But yeah, going back to the Blight there, I mean, it is set up. It absolutely is set up fine to me throughout the entirety of all the phases. It's just not that interesting. I think that's to be ultimately the biggest thing. It's not that the Blight can't work. It's not that the Blight shouldn't be there. It's just I never found it that interesting. I think especially it's hard because it's like this is a prequel story, so that it's gonna be gone. You know they're gonna beat it. You don't know how, but it's kind of hard to do this, like, all-consuming, world-ending type of villain when know for sure they're going to beat it, and not only are they gonna beat it, it's basically gonna have really no impact on the rest of the galaxy come the prequels and the main Star Wars story. Like, it's never gonna be mentioned again. And so, I think that for me was like, I can see Marchion Ro and the Nile threat never being mentioned again because that's a conflict that, like any war in our real life, you have a war, you wait 100 years, it's still a topic of conversation, but it doesn't mean as much that next generation, once the generation that dealt with this is gone, right? It's a piece of history. With the blight, you would think that this world destroying disease, for all a lack of a better term, would be something that people would be like, that planets and people and families and things would be completely devastated by for generations to come, and we know that that ultimately isn't the case. So I think that was kind of one of my other just kind of hesitancies with the blight, is it just you knew it wasn't going to have this overall impact as well. But I did love, let's talk about the nameless, because I did love the way it connected with the nameless. We all knew it was going to have some type of connection to the nameless because of not just what they do with phase 2, but because obviously it has the same properties that the nameless have. And in Temptation of the Force, they discover that it has very similar effects to defeat similar things that work on the nameless, work on the blight. And there's this crisscross and this whole symmetry between the two. And so we knew that was coming, but I definitely didn't expect like nameless chief who could communicate in your mind and talk to you and and has this like way with the force. Like I thought all that stuff was trippy, interesting, and I liked it. I like that type of Star Wars. I like that type of fantasy in Star Wars. You have these creatures who can commune through extra, or through magical means and telepathic creatures, and I liked all of that. I liked everything on Planet X that had to do with the blight origins and the nameless, and I liked how that all played into Avar and Elzar's journey. So that to me is really what saved the blight from being completely uninteresting, because it had a basis in this kind of more interesting force culture, force lore, and ultimately this vergence in the force, which I think they were kind of expecting probably to hit a lot harder because the acolyte did it, and I think I'm not saying that Trials did it only because of the acolyte. In fact, Trials might have had this all planned out first, but I do think they were hoping that, like, you'd have the idea of the Vergence and, like, the mystery around that hit in the Acolyte, and people would start to get familiar with that on a grander scale, a much larger amount of people than who are reading the High Republic, and then you have Vergence dropped as well in this story, and it's like, "Okay, yeah, what's really going on with the Force at this time?" There's, like, a lot of different mysteries around the different Vergence points and the way the Force is popping up in these interesting ways across the galaxy in different aspects of the galaxy in different areas and different breeds, and like the way it's creating these creatures and all this stuff. Like I think they were hoping that a lot of this crisscross between the two would play up a little bit more, but ultimately I thought the Vergence idea worked way better here. I mean, I'm always a little bit more interested in the way a Vergence can create devastation like this, like more of a dark side Vergence, more of a really a destructive Vergence to the rest of the galaxy rather than a Vergence that creates life. So I thought that was more fascinating, the way it was used by Soule here. But yeah, Sonic, what did you think of ultimately the nameless conclusion, the way the blight was wrapped up, and the way Charles Soule used the Vergence here on Planet X to be kind of the answer for our blight issue?
I'm mostly positive on it. I'll say I'm very positive on the nameless stuff because, like you said, I like that. It was out of left field. I was like, "Oh, they're not even, like, supposed to look like that as they're shown, right? They're not really monsters. They're kind of like very elegant looking long arm, like, creatures that are just meditating and swaying, and they're like, "Yeah, stuff happens. You kinda have to deal with it. It sucks, but we just it is what it is," and you're like, "What?" Like, they're not, like, celestials or anything per se, but, they're very interesting creatures that are almost kinda living in their own portal dimension, right? Like, that's I was hoping reading when they described, like, the very solid disk with, like, all the different floating little pieces and all that, you're like, "Oh, is this something that's maybe Sith or something?" Or, like, something that's kinda like that, something seed. What was the seed thing called on Kashyyyk and Into the Light? Sith seed or whatever it was, right? It seemed like almost,
Oh
like,
yeah, the
similar to that, and then you actually go into it and you're like, "Oh, it is not at all the same thing at all." Because 1, Elzar was stupid enough to reach out and go into it, but 2, you're like, "Oh, okay, like, there's a whole different dimension, like, it's all darkness and everything, and, Avar and, there's other nameless in there, but then there's these, like, pure nameless inside with the eggs and all that." You're like, "Oh, okay, like, yeah, yeah, okay, that's cool, that's pretty exciting, right?" So, absolutely loved it, I loved everything with, like, the concept of Planet X kinda being formed out of a virgin, so, like, an entire planet, like, I think if you wrote something like New Jedi Order today, Sonoma Sycot's probably built out of, like, that same concept, like, there was a tear in the universe, and then from there came this planet, right? So, I think that would be very cool to see again. Absolutely, I would love that for sure. The blight stuff, I do have some issues with, and it's more just because, like, the blight still in this book dominates so much. I wanted a little bit more, but, like, I know, like, some of it is, like, the effect of the nameless once you get this whole twist about them, is it's good to have less details in some ways, kinda let it breathe, kinda let it be something that can be explored in the future or still stay within its mystery. Not gonna disagree with that at all. My issue is, like, okay, that was all safe for, like, the last 25-30% of the book, and then we got these blight with the interludes and all that, and you're like, "I get it, it's consuming, I get it, I know it's sad for the family and all that, I understand." But it's like, why can't we have a little bit more direct connections with the eggs and the nameless themselves? Like, I understand hiding, like, the implication and, like, in Temptation of the Force with the nameless and how they're deployed out and all that. The eggs, I don't think the eggs were really ever truly used in the same way. Like, I wish that was something that was a little bit clearer about it, and then when you read something like Into the Light, you're like, "Oh, so there's some very interesting mutated Drengir that are being used. Okay, interesting, cool, but the blight is here." And you're like, "Is that 'cause of the Drengir or something?" And there's no real hints of like, "Oh, like, we found some broken eggs or something." Like, just, like, a throwaway line and stuff, I think would have been better in the middle of phase 3 to been like, "Okay, like, here's some things that we don't know what it means yet," or, like, it seems like lines like, "Okay, sure, there was a nameless on this planet, we pacified it," but still, having a little bit more of that would have really set up Trials of the Jedi with its such intense, quick pace to be like, "Oh, okay, now I'm seeing, like, finally all the little connective tissue being done here." There's so much about the middle of phase 3 that Trials of the Jedi almost kinda assumes you're like, you have to read everything again like phase 1 and gets an idea that there is a connection being made here. Okay, so there's a blight that happens on Coruscant. I understand it can just come out and every planet can be afflicted. Anything that has the living force can be afflicted by it. That's cool. But in my mind, I was like, I kinda wish there was something a little bit more concrete, like, just like a nameless being moved to the planet specifically causes it, right? Or like a seed or some sort or something that is connected, right? Some sort of egg fragment or something that's carried about them on the planet that causes this to happen, right? Something very specific, very deliberate, instead of just like it just happens, right? It happens, it's great. I had a funny thought that like maybe like they could have also explained a little bit more of the blight afterwards when Lena Snow's like talking about the reparations and like, what they're gonna do to like reintegrate everybody and all that. I wish they could have been like, yeah, some planets are just gonna be like one biome planets because that part of the planet that was like full of rainforest is now gone, but the desert part is there, and it slowly gets taken over, stuff like that. That's probably not how ecology works, but it would've been a fun way to, like, tie into, like, why is there so many one biome planets in the Star Wars galaxy instead of just George Lucas decided to make Tatooine all sand. Right, like, that could've been really interesting, like, devastation of the living force, it returns to some degree, right, as we see with, like, the father with his foot, it's like it's necrotic, but it's not light anymore. It'd be very interesting to be like, "Oh, the planet is living again, but only specifically this biome that didn't get touched yet," or stuff, right? Like, that stuff I think would've been interesting, like, maybe playing into, like, why, like, there's more Outer Rim planets that are kinda more messed up in general or kinda just more drab and worse for wear, and it could've been because of something like the blight. The blight just immediately gets neutralized, right? So, not having something very concrete about why it happens on these planets, right? Out of the blue, and then kinda just, like, shuffling through the end of, like, it just kind of relapses and, like, falls in on itself. Like, I was like, "Okay." That's the one thing I was like, I wish that could have been a little bit more deliberate about, because everything with the Nameless themselves and, like, your mutations with the Nile experimentation was like the Drengir too, that's very deliberate. Like, you didn't have to love all the execution of those ideas, but you can understand exactly what was happening. Like, yeah, do I love that the Drengir can kinda talk and they can fly a ship? No, not really, but there's still, like, very clear direction about what they're doing and what's being said and done for them. That I like. The Blight, you're like, "Oh, okay," like, there's no real specific reason or, like, no, like, interesting visual that they play about, like, for it to appear. It just happens to start, and they just discover very early stages, and then once the blight is finally eradicated from the galaxy, what are the effects, right? Like, with the Vong, with their Vong forming, you're like, "Oh my god, that's devastating." Yeah, Legends does not absolutely clean that up, kinda go over it until the Legacy comics about, like, we gotta, like, see if we can change the Vong form and make it healthier for the planets and all the devastation there. The blight itself, I'm like, "Well, at least leave us with consequences. At least leave us with, like, there's a good, like, 40 planets in the galaxy now that used to be so much richer in elements and industries and all that, but now are Tatooine. Now they're like like, where it's just one biome." If you had done something deliberate like that, I think that it starts to explain, like, what people feel about, like, "Oh, once the blight accelerated, it wasn't just 30, it might have been 300 by the end, and that's why these planets in some places are so rich, and other places they're not so much, and they're so dependent on the Republic, bringing resource, all that." And that, again, causes strain on the government, on the ideals of the High Republic, like Lena was talking about. Lets characters like the Trade Federation with all the new technology that Gira sells off to kinda like, "Oh, you don't have that? Well, I have these droids," and stuff like these could have been really interesting placements and allowed the Blight story to remain relatively the same, but actually leave with an impact. The Nameless, I understand they go back because they're held back by Elzar, they're held back by Avar. They're almost kind of balancing out the Virgins and everything. It's a very strange planet to get to in general. That stuff I was totally cool with, and it plays into that fantastical, supernatural stuff that's been there since, like, the '70s Star Wars comics. The Blight stuff, I was like, it was there for the longest time in Phase 3, and then it just in a snap, it's gone. I'm like, I just wish at least consequence remained for it."
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think all those ideas would be great ways to tie in the lasting effects. Maybe you do that in phase more. Maybe that is one of the big focuses is the aftermath and how that plays in the galaxy. But I think unfortunately right now it is definitely one of the things that like while wrapped up well, I was wanting a bit more from with Trials. And I think that's the last maybe point we talk about here in our spoiler discussion with Trials is just the what our overall thoughts are. Now we've sat on this book, right? We've read this over 3 weeks ago, and we've now sat with this book for a while. Do you still hold with the score you gave it? And do you think that this book is still that like strong ending that it felt back then? Because for me, I still feel the same way. I gave it a 4 out of 5. I would hold with that. I think it was a fantastic. It did extremely well. It's the things that are just left there that I think are the only things that rub you a little bit of the wrong way. And I don't necessarily blame Charles Soule and Trials of the Jedi for that. It feels like something you blame the High Republic as a whole for. And again, like we talked about a little bit earlier, just bit off more than it can chew. It had so many sets of characters, so many things going on that it was hard to wrap up everything. And even in a book that was 400 something pages, it couldn't wrap up every little plot point that was going on with the entire phase. And so I would have loved to see the second books, especially, do a little bit more heavy lifting to help wrap these things up. Like I thought the middle of phase 3 just didn't really lift anything up. Tears of the Nameless was great and it definitely got us closer to this conflict, but there was nothing targeting the rest of the galaxy, right? It was all so hyper focused on the blight conflict and just fixing the blight that there were things around the rest of the galaxy that definitely felt like, what's next? What's the aftermath? Where do we go? And I thought the epilogue, while nice for our main characters, definitely left the galaxy in a place to where I'm like, okay, so now where do we go? Like we have a great speech from Lena So, but what's, Joe Schmo's thoughts from Tatooine? Like, what are his thoughts on what just happened? Because we don't know the galactic ramifications of this, and it feels like it should be a lot more than what we have seen so far. So I still find those small criticisms with Trials and with the High Republic as a whole, but I still felt like this book was extremely well written. It tackled everything I wanted it to tackle. It nailed so many of the things that I felt like were, were make or break for the High Republic as a whole, whether it be Avar Elzar, whether it be Markion, whether it be the Nameless, all these things that could be major plot holes for future Star Wars stuff. I thought it wrapped them up extremely well, extremely satisfyingly, and just it made this story worth reading and something I'm excited to return to one day and something I absolutely recommend to everybody else. So I thought overall Trials still even 3 weeks on feels like something I am extremely satisfied with and something I am thinking about about a lot. Like I keep going back to this book and I have a lot of way more good memories upon my time reading this than negative ones in terms of where the story left you, because oftentimes you can read a book or you can watch a film and you have pros and cons when you review it, but then you wait a little bit of time and then like 2 3 weeks go by and you're like, okay, the cons are actually sticking with me far more than the pros, or vice versa. This time the pros are still so much superior to the cons that I felt like Trials of the Jedi still absolutely deserves the praise it was getting when it came out, and still remains to me one of the better books in the High Republic.
Yeah, I think I gave it like a 4.25, and I hold by that. I spent a lot of today kind of just, reading through a lot of the book, especially more the back end stuff, because the beginning, it's not it's not as fast as I remember it, right? I thought it was like, oh my god, we're kind of just being thrown into it right away. But there is some decent setup and everything. So I was a fan, of this book when I first read it. I let it sink a little bit on the last couple weeks, and now I'm like, "Yeah, no, this is still really good. This is still really fun." I had a great time reading it. Like I said, I did like everything on Planet X quite a bit. A lot of the criticisms that I have with this book, again, do not fall on Charles Soule. It falls very much on just Phase 3 kind of losing a lot of those, like, steadying voices of Phase 1 that seemed like they were fully in sync, and you've got George Mann, who does a lot of heavy lifting in Phase 3, but whereas, like, a character like a Cavan Scott, who I think would have been really exceptional as a writer here, not around, right? Like, it's a weird choice of, like, how they rebalance the authors between Phase 1 and Phase 2 coming into Phase 3, because I think that was my big struggle. Um, I I wish I wish that could have been rectified with a even longer book, arguably, 'cause I think Charles Soule could have handled, like, another 100 pages and catching up every single detail that we've had over the stories, make them way more integrated. Gives us a slower start, sure, but I think this is one of the books that you kinda need it, because everything else by the end, when it's accelerating every character that we've spent time with, you're like, "Yeah, that makes sense, it was worth it." But yeah, I can't blame him. He was the bookender. It just feels like everybody was still kinda stuck on, like, "This is my book, this is my author, this is my characters, and I'll stick with that," when Phase 3 should have been the most, like, connected between every book, between every reading level to get us to where Trials of the Jedi hits like this. Like, I read the comics, so Tarek and Sarek, they're really interesting characters. They've gone on a very fascinating journey as, Force-spawn twins, and seeing how their connection works across the galaxy, how it's only really interrupted by, like, hyperspace and all that. I think readers got a great time out of that, but having read all that stuff in the comics, I was like, "Whoa, this is insane." Like, Charles Soule is giving so much payoff for all these fantastic characters and their arcs. But why wasn't that sprinkled a little bit more here and there? Like, Buckets of Blood? He he's just not a character that you expect to, like, really come into this story. He just happened to really work out here, and then it gets cut short. Obviously, he is the one severe casualty of the story, and then you're like, "Dang, okay, he was kinda cool." Like, I didn't ever see this side of him in the comics, especially with these little kid comics, right? More targeted, like, middle schoolers. Okay, then why am I suddenly invested in this character? Well, Charles wrote him really well, but now I'm like, I just wanna know more about all this stuff. So, Yeah, if anything, it's just a lack thereof of connectivity, of, like, smoothness between Phase 3, and especially with the release schedule, making that a lot more obvious. Um, I guess I have some criticism about, like, not really understanding the transformation of the Nile from, the storms, the strike, all that to where they are now. Like, I think Phase 3 started off really well with the ministers, like, Bulin and everybody. That was pretty clear. But it did this weird choice again of, like, I would've at least gotten a little bit more understanding of how the Nile structure works under General Vise and how it's transformed outside of just her, like, "Oh," I felt like I kinda have to put some organization. Instead of that, it was like, "Oh, this is how the Nile have changed a lot." And not just leave everything to the comics. That's one thing that Charles Soule heavily hit on in Light of the Jedi. I was kinda shocked that he never really spent some time, like, with, like, a Nile grunt's perspective of how things have really changed. There's, like, that one grunt that's like, "I remember the good old days," and then his life is cut short because of a of a mind trick, right? But I was like, "Wow, more richness, more detail, maybe, somebody a little bit more higher up next up," and then General we've gotten all 3 of those perspectives from grunt all the way to, like, minister of something, right? Then I think I would've really appreciated, like, knowing what they've done in the absence of marking arts, like, planning and leadership, in the absence of, really having a big fight on their hands and being the insurgents, with Kira kinda taking more of the I think those are things I found on the second read I was kinda missing more, but I can't, again, blame that on Charles Soule. He had so many other things and handled characters that he's never touched with great respect and added elements and stuff that really worked. I mean, Porter was just fantastic in this book, and he doesn't really have a huge role, but it's a great couple chapters with him, and you're like, "Awesome, sweet." So, still, I would give it a 4.25. I think it's just another 100 pages. This could have honestly been like a 5 out of 5, like, book for me, like, and expecting him to write for Star Wars fans, like, epic fantasy length novels, it's a little too much. This one was already pushing it, right? So, I was like, "Okay, I understand that. I understand there are still some limitations with this franchise versus some author who gets to play with their own magic structure, their stories, their characters, and have full control." He's just a part of the puzzle, a very big central core of it, but he can't be expected to, like, suddenly lift everybody up from the very end of it. Like, George Mann did his best, and that's why this book works in Phase 3. If we didn't have that and he still wrote the book the same way, I would have been disappointed, but because of that, still good.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And I think again, the 100 pages thing would be awesome just because you don't need to Return of the King this book, but having some bigger epilogue, some
Yeah.
real impact on the galaxy. It would have been nice to see some of that or the wrap up of the Nile, the ultimate defeat of the Nile. Like just smaller things like that that ultimately get sidelined for the grander bigger scale of the blight, it's nice to obviously wrap that up, but the Nile to me the most interesting part of this whole thing as from phase one. So I think there were those missed opportunity Charles Soule problems. There problems from the entirety of phase one and phase three, the way it was constructed. So ultimately, still, this is to me one of the best books in the High Republic with the initiatives warts and all. We have Rebel Sith who's commenting and says, I would rate Trials a solid 8.5 out of 10. I think Vernestra should have been a part of the team or had a bigger point of view role in finding their way with the second team. Maybe um Okay, I'm not sure what that's a different comment, I believe. So yeah, but I agree. Vernestra should have been in a little bit more of the story. She definitely felt like a weird one to sideline, especially with her importance in the Acolyte. It felt like you could have given her an even bigger role here. I was disappointed with Acolyte Wayseeker because it didn't do anything to really make her more like the Vernestra in that show. And so any little piece of information that really could have elevated her, I thought would have worked immensely for these stories, but unfortunately, they didn't go with that. But the stuff that she did have, I thought was very, very good. So glad you really enjoyed the book as well. 8.5 out of 10 is a very, very good score. And I think let's use that to move on because I know Rebel Sith also comments here. Another thing that I think will lead us into our next topic and says that I think Tears the Nameless was my favorite book, and I love Eye of Darkness. It was great too, but it dragged it out way too far. Markion just being a lazy bum, down Charles Soule and George Mann save Phase 3 in the High Republic overall, and George Mann needs a promotion at Lucasfilm. Filoni should put him up on the creative team and wants him to become co-president. Wow, that's really high praise. In terms of like he should be writing more Star Wars books. I don't know if I'm quite ready to say he needs to be president of Lucasfilm, but I think he is somebody who's obviously an incredible storyteller and has done it in every way. You know, he's done young adult. He's written arguably the best young adult book in the entire phase or entirety of the High Republic. He's written one of the best adult books with Eye of Darkness. He's done the best audio drama with The Battle of Jeddah. He's done some great junior novels as well with Quest for the Hidden City. He's really done it all. And also on top of that, he's done comics. So he kind of does everything for the High Republic. He really is. If you want to take one person who's kind of been just able to master pretty much every form, it's been George Mann. Kevin Scott's right there as well. Didn't get the play in Phase 3. It feels like George Mann, even though he wasn't part of Phase 1, was far more involved in the second and third thirds of the High Republic and kind of left a bigger imprint ultimately on the finale. So definitely agree that George Mann should be writing more Star Wars books. And now he is an author that when he writes something for Star Wars that's going to be inevitably outside of the High Republic, I will be extremely excited to see what he can do with our non-High Republic characters, and I can't wait to see where his career goes from here because he's absolutely been somebody who can't kind of I was familiar with Star Wars because he'd done the myths and fables and stuff like that, but he has become somebody who now is on that Soul Gray Adam Christopher tier of like if they get announced for a book, I am very excited to see what that book ultimately is.
Yeah, I guess kinda working backwards, I will say no to, I know what you're saying, Filoni, once he becomes, like, the president, co-president, George Mann should get a promotion. No, I'll say that just because, like, one unique thing about the High Republic is that he works within a narrative already predefined, right? Like, he works with the pieces that are already laid out. Like, Reed's stylus is not defined by him. He's definitely reshaped a lot of later stage Reed for sure, but all the elements of Reed's stylus, for example, all the elements of Comac, that comes from Claudia Gray. So and if anybody is gonna get a promotion at this point from all these authors, it probably would be Claudia because she has written the most successful, like, standalone books for Star Wars. She's written, the Princess Leia young adult book, she's written Master and Apprentice, obviously Bloodlines is, like, a huge book for her, Lost Stars, like, it's not something that he's done. He's only worked in the High Republic initiative for the most part and, like, the Myths and Fables, and that's I need to see what he does first, like, I'm not saying that he's not an incredible writer, he is, he very clearly kicked off Phase 3 on a really strong footing, and then Tears of the Nameless is, a great example of what a young adult novel can and should be like, especially in the Star Wars universe, where you can still play around with some more mature themes and all that, still play around with, like, heavy plot and, character arcs and all that, and not feel like, "Oh, this just feels like a junior novel book, but with more words." He absolutely nailed the scale, the level, the details necessary without feeling like, "Oh, we're taking away from these adult novels." Right? We read Tears of the Nameless, and we read Into the Light, and we're like, "Well, okay, at least I understand, like, this is just a plot in Into the Light." But Tears of the Nameless, oh, man, that's huge for Trials of the Jedi. That's so important to the character. That's so important to understanding him and Aslan and everything else, right? Now I wanna see him write his own Star Wars book that's in a different era, a little bit more in a era of Star Wars that is more familiar to, like, the general audiences, like, maybe he does the Adam Christopher route, and he gets to write something that's set in, like, the post-Episode 6, pre-Episode 7, right? I'd love to see him kinda flesh out what his own individual novel, like, at 30 years, you can do a big, fun, interesting story without necessarily having to be tied or laid down by anything. That's what I would say is next for him. I need to see what he can achieve with legacy characters, what he can achieve with eras that are a little bit more well known. So that's what I would personally say for but yeah, I will say, I very true as a whole. I also agree with your whole point that Habuyaga survived Starlight. Um, we kinda already knew some of that. It was in the short stories that we got between phase 1 or phase 2 and phase 3 kicking off. We got to see the Bell perspective of it. This is just the first time we've ever heard exactly how Buryaga made it to the cave. So, again, not something I necessarily wanted to have to find out from a comic in Shadows of the Starlight, from short stories, and then finally in the last ever book for the High Republic for a full encapsulation of that story, but I at least enjoy that we got to see different parts and different perspectives instead of just repeating it. I think that at least was pretty cool, like, not knowing that, like, this dude went into a Rathar, used his claws, sealed it behind him, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm about to crash down to a planet. What's gonna be, like, a good enough heat sink for me? I guess a dead Rathar corpse right now," like, that was cool, that was pretty interesting to see. But yeah, I definitely agree with you saying about Tears of Nameless being your favorite, loved Eye of Darkness. Marchion was I say Marchion, I know people say it's Marchion, it's kind of both, but I say Marchion. That's just a little thing that I've always had since the first one. But yeah, he was a bit of a bum. He was pretty lazy. I wanted to see him do more, and then in this book, he's like, "I'm just gonna kill, like, my head of security," right? Just 'cause I need to get a hit of, like, being a Nihil again, being this crazy killer, right? That we saw him absolutely dominate as throughout phase 1. Just it never really shone through phase 3 until more of this back half, more of, like, frankly, mostly just this book, so, a bit of a shame on that front, but yeah, we've already discussed it in exhaustion at this point. Phase 3, the unevenness, the release schedule, the dependency on a lot of the newer writers instead of just some of the phase 1 writers coming back, really put a lot of onus on like someone like a George Mann succeeding, and because he succeeded, that's why Trials with however Charles wrote it actually stands the test, but still a little shameful that we didn't get some of the same hype and continuity of, like, excitement that we had in phase 1.
Definitely. And let's move on to the next section of the video. And I think right now, one of the things we can do, and we just talked about Rebel Sith saying that Trials was one of his favorite books in the entirety of the initiative. Let's talk about our favorite books from the adult novel side, the juniors novel side, and then the young adult novel side. We'll start with the adult novel side. Let's start with Trials of the Jedi. Sonic, where does this book rank for you amongst the entirety of the adult novels? We had 8 of them from start to finish. We had Light of the Jedi, we had Rising Storm, Fallen Star, then Convergence, Cataclysm, Eye of Darkness, Temptation of the Force, and then finally Trials of the Jedi. Where does this rank amongst all of those for you?
Oh, tough, 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 tough. Yeah, like I said, I'm very positive on this book, but it has its flaws, without a doubt. I I will say it's behind Rising Storm and behind The Light of the Jedi, and then it's Trials. I think it might be my 3rd favorite of the adult novels. I used to have Cataclysm up there, but again, Phase 2 being so disconnected and a lot of Cataclysm really not undoing, like, reframing Convergence, was why I was really happy about it, but we don't really have a lot from that book. Any Path of Vengeance is kind of more important with its ending and, like, its overlap ending to what goes on here in Phase 3. So I would say Trials comes in as number 3. It's I don't know if I'd call it, like, an S tier level book as Rising Storm, Light of the Jedi. Those 2 work so well hand in hand. Trials is real comparison hand in hand is, like, Eye of Darkness, and I think they're just totally differently written books. So much happens in Phase 3 that you're like, "Oh, okay," like, it doesn't really feel like there's a lot of a bridge there, and I know Temptation's in between it, but again, Temptation kind of plays to me as more like a romance novel more than anything else, which I don't mind. I really didn't. I think, again, that pays off a lot of those decisions made there, but it very much is like almost like a not standalone per se, but it kinda has to be like, "Okay, you haven't read a lot of these books in a while, but read this and you'll get everything you kinda need," which I never got that feeling from Light of the Jedi or The Rising Storm. It was like, I'm reading these books, they build off each other, they reframe stuff from each other, like, it's very plot driven, there's so much more richer detail as a whole. Charles just doesn't have the time to go into, like, super, super crazy in debt because he's trying to deal with so many different moving pieces, right? I'm thankful that he, like, mentions stuff like Keith Trennis and all that and how they, like, do a whole blockade in the comics to stop the Nile Force from evacuating and all that. That's something that was missing in stuff like Fallen Star, and that's why this book definitely rises above it. But again, this is also a book that I think another 100 pages would not have hurt. I think if it has that, then it might be pushing up there at like as like all 3 books being on perfectly even ground. Right now, it's maybe if those are like pure S tiers, be like S minus A plus.
Yeah, for me, it's a tough one to rank as well because, like you're saying, phase two just feels so disconnected now. We're so far away from phase two that it's hard to trudge up those memories from phase two to remember those good times with phase two. And honestly, phase two might be the most cohesive, best phase
Yeah,
overall in terms of start to finish cohesive storytelling across all mediums. It really did lock in and tell one singular nice story, but it's not necessarily as memorable as what they do with phase one, phase three with the Nile, and then eventually with the Blight. So it is a tough one to rank, but I still have this one coming in around my fourth favorite adult novel, right in the middle. I like Light of the Jedi still my favorite, and Rising Storm number two. And then I still do put Cataclysm at that number three. It just was such a surprise. I loved it. I thought it was so epic, so awesome. I basically had no issues with it whatsoever. Trials is that next step where I think it's a book that has some flaws, but overall the storytelling is so exciting and so grand, so really excellent with what it tries to do that even the things that it doesn't quite accomplish, you can let those go for how great the story is there. And then The Eye of Darkness, I think, is that last like great book that we have to run down out of the adult novels there because the Eye of Darkness is still, to me, a fantastic start to phase 3. I really did love what it did, even 2 years on. It's just a little bit unfortunate that, like, most of the stuff it sets up doesn't really get finalized until this book, which I think both makes The Eye of Darkness
yeah,
better now, as opposed to a year ago when we were still waiting to find out, okay, well, where's all this going to go? Like, where's the V story and Porter Engle's story going, which is so prominent in Eye of Darkness? Where are the different, factions going to end up? How does the storm wall and the connection with that, and now this blight conflict is so big in the temptation? Like, how are all these things going to tie up? At least to me, with the Eye of Darkness, we ultimately got things that were super satisfying for where that was. So I feel like that's going to be one that works even better when you go back and read it another time. So for me, that would be my fifth favorite. And then I have Fallen Star at sixth. I think Fallen Star, I still have all the pros and cons I had with it. It's extremely memorable. I think it was a little bit too short as well. It's almost too hyper focused. I would have loved a little bit more Markion, but still right around, it's still a really really good book. It just doesn't quite hit the heights of those other five for me, but those top six are really all very 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 good books. And then you have, to me, Temptation of the Force at seven, which is, like you were saying, a nice little offshoot story, something that feels important for the Avar Elzar relationship, but doesn't necessarily feel that important in terms of story. There's some good stuff for other characters who don't get as much time to shine in adult novels, like Buryaga and like Vernestra, but ultimately it's kind of a book. When you look at phase three, it's by far the least interesting and most underwhelming of the three adult novels. And then Convergence is still last. I think it's still the most mediocre an adult novel has been. Now it sets up a lot of stuff that Cataclysm does extremely great things with, but it's still kind of an underwhelming flat book. And the Jedi are the least interesting part of it. And so that's always kind of an L when you are looking at a Star Wars book. The Jedi should be one of the most interesting parts of it. So yeah, that's how my adult novels would shake out. But let's talk about YA. Um, Sonic, for you, what was the standout of the YA side for you? What's your favorite YA book from High Republic now looking back on this whole thing? We had 8 books in that realm as well, starting out with Into the Dark. Then we moved to Out of the Shadows, Midnight Horizon. Then we had Phase Two's Path of Deceit and Path of Vengeance. And then with Phase 3, we had Defy the Storm, Tears of the Nameless, and Into the Light.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh boy. Tough, tough, tough. Yeah, I don't know, cause like, again, this is where phase 2, like you said, it's like the consistent of the 3 phases, even if it's the most disconnected, right? Like, Path to Deceit is a fantastic book. And I do definitely have a lot of fond memories still of Path to Vengeance. I again, was a little harsher on it compared to Path to Deceit because it does have a lot of overlap with Cataclysm, and Cataclysm does handle a lot of that perspective better. It's more just getting the Martyr Row perspective and everything going on there. Yeah, again, like we said, the YA novels, they don't super well connect to the main narrative, so it's a little hard to judge, and then suddenly Phase 2 is the one that's, like, the most important to, like, not just the Phase 2 narrative as a whole. It is more important than the adult novels collectively or Cataclysm, but it's it's also just yeah, I don't know, it's tough. It's this is a really tough one because it's so important to the Phase 2, it's so important to where we are set up in Phase 3, right, and everything going on with the Nile and their history and how that affects Markion Rowe and the decision making that he's been doing a lot in Phase 3. But he's not really a YA novel sorta guy anyways. It's like, yeah, it's a weird one. Just because of, like, how exciting Humbling was around it and how wonderful a read it was, I'll still say Tears of the Nameless kind of edges out for first for me right now. I think Path to Deceit might be a better written book, but for me, I there's nothing about Path to Deceit was surprising, but I figured, like, okay, it's gonna be pretty good between Justina and Zoraida. George, man, I didn't really have, like, much expectations for him pulling off what he did with Eye of Darkness, but better with Tears of the Nameless. I think that was what was shocking for me. The Comac return, I think, was handled really well. Finally getting some understanding about, like, everything going on with the Nile and the Blight and the Nameless, right? Like, a lot of that stuff felt very disconnected until that point. Pushing and elevating Reeth up to the character status that I think Into the Dark was really trying to set him up for, but then again, like a lot of other characters, he kinda got washed away because he was in other mediums like comics and dealing with more like the B plot enemies like the Drengir for a long time, so having him be more fully into the A plot of villainy was really cool to see there. So I'd say Tears, then Path of Deceit, then Path of Vengeance, um after that, I feel like those are the top 3 for sure. I can maybe give some fondness towards what we see in Into the Light, just because I do like Claudia Gray and how she writes her characters, but there isn't a lot of story per se that I really cared for there. I really do think that's the top 3 for me when it comes to young adult novels. I think there's a lot of importance for all 3. I think the writing is the best there, most detail, most influence on the initiatives as a whole. So yeah, I'd go with that as my top 3.
Yeah, I have pretty much the same top 3. I have Tears of the Nameless, Path of Deceit, Path of Vengeance. Those were all so much better than really anything in terms of detail and story. Tears of the Nameless to me is easily number 1. I love Path of Deceit. I thought it was a huge surprise, both on really every level. One, the YA hadn't been that great since Into the Dark, and even Into the Dark wasn't something I was overly impressed with. It was just the best by far of the YA we had had. Then two, the creative team. I wasn't a huge fan of what Justina Ireland had done on Out of the Shadows, and so I was a little hesitant for what she was going to do there. And then the fact that it was now a new phase, and we were starting this new phase with YA, it just felt like it was set up for failure. And then ultimately it's actually pretty great. So I really like Path of Deceit. That's number 2. And Path of Vengeance would be closer to Path of Deceit, I think, if the story was a little tighter. Now you can argue it's a lot more impactful, it has a lot more weight. It really is almost one of the most essential YA books to read. I would say probably the second most essential YA book to read after Tears of the Nameless, and absolutely essential for the ending of Phase 2. Whereas Path of Deceit, I think it's important, but you could kind of skip it if you had to, because a lot of the bulk of the story of Phase 2 really is in Convergence, Battle of Jeddah, Cataclysm, and then Path of Vengeance. But it's not worth reading Path of Vengeance without Path of Deceit. So anyway, Path of Vengeance is just it's extremely dense and it has a lot of great story, but it does have a middle act that's a little bit dull and a little bit slow. It's picks up a little bit now after Trials of the Jedi, after going back to Planet X, but ultimately that was a little bit underwhelming. But a great beginning, great end, and then after that, YA really does just get a lot of good stuff and a lot of not so good stuff. Into the Dark, I still think is a very good book. I love what it does for Wreath now overall, like the start of Wreath. But it does feel like a long time ago, and I wasn't that impressed at the time. I thought it was a very good book, like a 3.5 or 3.75 out of 5, but not necessarily going to be one of the great books of all time. And then Into the Light, I would put at number 5. I just think it was a good book, even if the plot was a little bit underwhelming. But it's really more so the quality of the next three that makes it number 5 by default. Because I just didn't think Defy the Storm, which is my number 6, was that good. It was really, really slow in the first act. It took forever to get going. And it was all about recapping my least favorite book of YA, which is Out of the Shadows. That would be my number 8, which makes Midnight Horizon number 7. But yeah, Defy the Storm, I thought was really messy at the beginning. It redeems itself with a better third act, kind of like Out of the Shadows does, but Out of the Shadows just has such a slow first two acts that I was really out of it by the time we got to that third act. And then Midnight Horizon is just one of the most forgettable stories in all of the High Republic. I remember liking it a little bit more when we read it at the time, but it is just kind of one of those things that's just gone by the wayside. I didn't really love how Wreath and Comac in there, and then they're set up for this next phase where their storytelling is a lot better in phase 3. So yeah, that's how I do the YA. And now let's talk about middle grade real quick before we move on to the last couple sections of this live stream tonight. Middle grade has been kind of all over the place as well. I would say, really, for the most part, there aren't really any essential middle grade books to read. Um, the most essential to me would still be A Test of Courage, just because it introduces Vernestra, it introduces Emery, and I think it's still a nice, compact little middle grade book. But as for junior novels, Sonic, which ones were your standouts and least favorites of the High Republic?
Well, I do believe it starts off with a bang with A Test of Courage. I think that still by far is the most influential of the junior novels, of the middle grade novels, because Vernestra gets introduced there, and she's a fantastic character that's shown up in the young adult novels, and Acolyte, right? Again, don't love her in the Acolyte, but the fact that she started off in a junior novel and then shows up in a live action Disney Plus TV show, unfathomable, right? It's already crazy enough that the era got connected here, and I get, like, probably Lucasfilm Story Group being like, "Oh, this is a character that'll fit the kind of character that you're trying to write here." Sure, makes sense, Leslie, I can see why she would go for this character. The fact that still at the end of the day, it started off in a book that, you're seeing in the stores, right? It's not even like an adult novel, standard trade paperback or anything like that. It's like one of those hardcover, squarish books, has a couple pictures in it and all. That being the starting point for a character to have become this important, this famous, not just in this initiative, but outside of it too, fantastic, and I think it's well written, especially her dynamic with Imri, that perspective of the Great Disaster is really because that is a very dramatic story to tell, from the very start of this initiative. Light of Jedi does not shy away from how many people die. Jedi, regular people, all that, right? But then to be able to, like, explain how devastating it is without, like, overwhelming, like, a very young kid getting into Star Wars, I think Tessa Courage does that fantastically. It focuses on, like, how Imri's starting to get affected and hurt and shaped by all of it too. Yeah, I thought that stuff pretty dang good. I was pretty shocked by just how well that was handled. Like you said, there isn't truly any, like, important, super important ones after that. Like, again, none of these really are, but, hmm, well, I'm trying to this is because I just did these rankings, but where would I put it? I guess looking at my rankings here, hmm, yeah, I did really like Escape from Valve, and I'll say as a whole, Phase 3, like you brought up, Liam, way more consistent with their junior novels because they, for the most part, keep the crew the same between all 3. Like, some of them show up for 2 books, and it might be the first 2 books or, like, the 2nd and 3rd book, right? And then they have a couple players from, like, Phase 1, like Imri, who shows up in that final one. But I thought Escape from Valo from kinda dealing with Ramjamorum and then these kids back on Valo, kinda dealing with the fallout of Valo, letting kids kinda see how the Rising Storm still affects and shapes everything going on here. Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. I'd give that as my number 2. Not super important, but again, I think the writing around it was probably a bit better. But yeah, after that, I don't know what I would say. I guess the Mission to Disaster is not bad. I do like how Vernestra and Luli Telsoa actually become characters. You get to connect to the High Republic adventures and see some of that dynamic play out. I thought that was pretty good. Phase 2 has some very forgettable one. There's only 2 to be fair, but I think Quest for the Hidden City is much better. I did like how unique it was, kinda having, little, Padawan kinda, like, go through this whole journey of understanding what it means to be a Padawan, like, kinda going through her own Jedi trials. I like that. Uh, and then the rest of the Phase 3 junior novels, what is it called? Beware the Nameless, and then A Valiant Vow, those we met next to. Then we come into the last 2, which I think are just generally not very good. I remember loving Race to Crash Point Tower for its energy and its connectivity by literally sharing, like, one shared chapter between that and the Rising Storm. That's the peak of interconnectivity I've ever felt from the High Republic, where directing 2 characters and then you split off those 2 characters. One will be followed in the adult, one will be followed in the junior novel, and I thought that was fantastic. But it's not very good besides that. And then the very last one, Quest for Planet X, you would think literally being home with the Nameless, there'd be some really interesting things kinda thrown out there, and even if it's not super heavy, there's nothing there. It's a really poor book. I remember trying to read through it, and I was struggling so hard. So I think those last 2, I wouldn't really recommend. I think there's definitely a huge gap between number 7 and number 8, but those first 4 and or let's say the first 6, I'd be like, yeah, if you got a kid who's trying to get into the High Republic, I would recommend that, especially the Phase 3 ones, just because they get to stick around with those characters. Not bad, not bad at all, but A Test of Courage really does blow every other one out of the water.
Yeah, it does. It's to me the best one still easily. As for the rest of middle grade, it's kind of a toss up between what overall you like about middle grade, I guess, because they're all kind of straightforward, kind of fun adventure stories in their own right. Some, like one of my least favorites would be Race to Crash Point Tower, and it's because it is kind of bogged down in that like Rising Storm story. It's just kind of a circular story. It doesn't feel like its own narrative. So there's those type, and then there are the ones like Beware the Nameless that actually feel like I thought dealt really good lessons while also having much higher consequences than they usually do. So for me, A Test of Courage is my number one. Number two is Mission to Disaster for me. It's just I think it piggybacks nicely off of A Test of Courage and continues that story. It has, like I was complimenting with Phase 3, that kind of consistent group of characters. It's nice to go back to the Emery, Vernestra characters and really kind of bookend Phase 1 with both of them. I would have liked a story that was maybe a little bit more important, but overall their journey, I thought between the two of them works really well between those two. So that those are still the standouts for me. Beware the Nameless, I did really like though. I thought it was a little bit elevated in terms of like the actual lessons the kids learn, because most of the times, these middle grade books, we're not the target audience, but they are very simple. You can understand immediately what's going to happen with them. It's like this person has a conflict and they have to learn to believe in themselves and believe in their team, and then the power of friendship will win over in the end. But Beware the Nameless actually has severe consequences, and I did actually like the character of Churro. I thought that was a fun little character. So Beware the Nameless next for me. And Quest for the Hidden City, George Mann, just a really fun adventure book. Not anything that's going to make you think, but it's a good time. And for me, I thought that one was pretty solid. So that was my number four. After that, it's kind of a toss up. A Valiant Vow and Escape from Valor, I both was kind of in the same place with. The Valiant Vow felt way too short. It felt kind of abrupt and just kind of like a story that was there. It didn't really connect to the overall end. Felt like it could have had more importance considering where Beware the Nameless was, and how it did kind of connect to the universe at larger with having the Nameless a part of it. Valiant Val just kind of felt like it was there. It was nice to see Emery back, but ultimately felt like that one was kind of forgettable. And Escape from Valo was also, to me, it was overlong. It was kind of overly long and didn't had so many side plots that took away from the pacing. For me, pacing's big with these kids books. One, for kids' attention spans, and two, for my attention span with this type of material. The fact that it's so, juvenile, often you kind of need a faster paced book. And that one was a little bit too long for my taste. It also just kind of creeped too much into YA themes for me. Like with these kid books, I kind of just want action, basic stuff. And that one was like there were a bunch of relationships and crushes and all these different things that just felt like I was reading a YA book. And while it still was written fine, I thought it was written well. It kind of felt like, okay, I want to get back to the main Nile conflict and like the stuff here. And then there were a lot of other random characters in that one for me, like the Nile best friend, who was like that character could have been so much more interesting when paired with the Jedi, which I'm forgetting his name, but the Jedi who's in that book, they're like they have this history, and you see it a lot in flashbacks, but it's kind of just it's there for conflict's sake, and they don't go into it as much. So, Escape from Valor had a lot of ideas that I thought were cool, but even with being overly long, it was just kind of overly stuffed and didn't answer a lot of the things that I really hoping it would get to. And then Race for Crash Point Tower and Planet X, I thought were the bottom of the barrel. I think those are the two weakest by far. But yeah, that wraps up our coverage of the High Republic books. We were going to get into over 2 hours, almost 2.5 hours. So maybe comics and that we could do another stream here in the future, specifically about comics and the rest of the High Republic tie-ins. But I think the way to wrap up this stream is now we've talked about pretty much every angle of the High Republic. We've talked about all the different books. We've talked about the structure and the way the phases were mapped out and all of that. Let's compare it one final time to the rest of what we've seen with Star Wars and kind of look at maybe the things that this initiative did better than some of those phases or some of those other initiatives, and some of the things it did worse, and maybe in future initiatives from canon, because this is really the first and only true publishing initiative we have seen from canon. Maybe in other initiatives from canon, they can learn from stuff from Legends and learn from things from this. So let's start there. And I specifically wanted to kind of point out the three different styles we've had in Legends in the past. So we've had smaller, more hyper focused multimedia initiatives like Shadows of the Empire. That's all centered around like 1 to 2 stories that exist in the same exact moment, but you do have book, comic, video game, and junior novels. So you cover all the bases of publishing plus video games, and so that's one type of storytelling. Then you have New Jedi Order, which is a bigger, more expansive initiative than pretty much anything else we ever saw in Legends, but it's only through books, and then of course the ebook tie-ins and novellas there. And then later, years down the line, it would get a prequel comic series and then some other tie-in books, but pretty much it was focused on those 19 books plus the ebook tie-ins. And then you have something like Clone Wars Multimedia Project, which for both the Clone Wars Multimedia Project and Clone Wars Multimedia Project, both of them were really just media that was put around the TV shows. That was the centerpiece. I would say the 03 to 05 Clone Wars Multimedia Project was far more multimedia focused than 2008 was, where 2008 was more treated like how they treat the films, where it's like we've got our centerpiece, now we just need some tie-in stuff. And even though there were still some good books that came out with that material, it wasn't necessarily they didn't have important gaps filled like '03 to '05 actually did with comics and with novels as well. So I think honestly, if you look at all these, we like to compare it to New Jedi Order a lot just because the amount of books, but really to me, the most comparable is Clone Wars Multimedia Project, even if the High Republic never had a TV show that really coincided with the true story of the High Republic. Like the Acolyte is considered High Republic, but it's not really a part of this narrative. It's its own thing. And so really the only TV show you have within the actual narrative of the High Republic is Young Jedi Adventures. So right there, it is kind of difficult to compare Gendy Tartakovsky's Clone Wars with Young Jedi Adventures. But in terms of the way the stories were structured and all had kind of importance, I think it really is an amalgamation of Clone Wars Multimedia Project and New Jedi Order. But looking at all of those different things, Cynic, how would you kind of compare it to some of the initiatives we've seen in the past? Did you think this worked better in some ways than some of those other ones that we've seen in the past? And what would you maybe take from some of those other ones to apply to an future canon multimedia projects like the High Republic?
I think you said it best in the sense of, like, it's not truly comparable to one specific initiative because, again, this is a very all-encompassing thing that the High Republic did. It didn't just go for full print, it went for full print with different reading levels. We haven't really seen that explored before. We've had, like, the Junior Jedi Knights and Young Jedi Knights stuff, but that was kinda more of an exclusive thing in the '90s. They didn't really push that as much in the early 2000s and 2010s. So a little it's, like, not really one-to-one there, but then you have comics, then you have audio dramas, you have all these different things that you're like, "Oh, where exactly does that fit and compare?" Right? That's a really hard one to really judge, so I do agree, it's like a blend of New Jedi Order and '03 to '05, Clone Wars multimedia project. I st I still think as a whole, it is a bit better than what we got with the Clone Wars multimedia project. I think you look at books like Shatterpoint and you're like, "Wow, that's fantastic," right? But I think Clone Wars multimedia project is kinda carried by those comics. Unfortunately, a lot of those comics just don't sit well, they don't play well with everything that George Lucas and Dave Filoni started doing. The '08 Clone Wars really kicked in, right? Like, the Republic comics are fantastic, right? I think they do get a little bit edgelord, and they do some weird Alis Cure that I'm not the biggest fan of, but I like that relationship between Tom and Quinlan and seeing how that all kind of plays off and building off of the original Star Wars line that was rebooted, at the start of the Phantom Menace and seeing how it evolved into something really cool like this, and then kinda went into dark times, right? I thought that was all really fantastic stuff there. But, I again, it's those books are like Cestus to Cestus I don't really care for or think too much about, right? The Approaching Storm, like, cool, like, all these stuff line up, those are important placements, but not necessarily great books, right? So and again, I've never been the hugest Shatterpoint fan, I know it's well regarded, I think it's pretty good for sure, but it's yeah, I think the books as a whole handled better. The best of the best from the High Republic, I think is still better than Clone Wars Multimedia Project. New Jedi Order, I still think clears it for the High Republic right now with consistency, right? It's a lot more consistent all the way throughout. I'm a big fan of all that stuff, but yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one. It's a tough one to say. If I could sum it down cleanly, I still would give Clone Wars Multimedia Project the edge for the comics and all the visual stuff there, over the High Republic, because the High Republic kind of flooded a lot of that stuff out there. I would say New Jedi Order is still a bit better than the best of the High Republic books, but because it's combining both, that's where it edges out, the New Jedi Order initiative and the Clone Wars Multimedia initiative, because I think it handled things all at once and not terrible in the execution.
right, having some type of technical difficulty here. 1 second. All right, I think I'm back. Okay. Um, to wrap this up, sorry about that, guys. Having some type of error with the I wasn't able to hear pretty much anything Sonic was saying. I was trying to figure it out. Um, but so hopefully I don't repeat some of the things he just said. But yeah, I feel like uh really the main thing the High Republic can take from these other multimedia projects is purely just pacing. I think the way the High Republic stretched out for the story it was trying to tell, I don't know if we needed 4 full years, and if we did do 4 full years, I don't know if we needed it to be spread out this thin and this far. So I think pacing is a big thing that they can learn in the future. If you're going to do a 4-year long initiative, maybe try to give like some big boost point in each year. And that's kind of to me the way that the new Jedi Order handled it. You have New Jedi Order had the big, like hardcover books that were the big turning points and they were the jump points for the initiative. So every hardcover jumped a year in time. It was like one one big jump forward. All the characters grew. You had the big plot points that kind of were affecting the paperbacks that were building off. After that, then the paperbacks would take each individual set off. You had your Jason book, you had your Jaina book, you had your Anakin books, you had your Rogue Squadron books, you had your Wraith Squadron books, you had your Han and Luke and Leia books. You had like all these spin off books outside of what the big books did. And I think with High Republic, even though this was, like we said, an original stories, there were too many characters. And so by focusing things on big crux points, at least you can kind of sell that excitement to your audience again. I felt like they did that in phase one, where like Light of the Jedi felt like this big epic point. Rising Storm with the Battle of Valo and the Valo Fair, like that felt like this big must read point, and then Fallen Star felt like this big must read thing. But then after that, they kind of just let the narrative flow. And if you were into the High Republic, you were into it, and if you weren't into it, you weren't into it. And they didn't really actively try to get new people back on board. It felt like it just kind of was like you're either in it or you're not. And I would have loved to see them take the approach of with the adult novels again in phase three, just have these big moments to get people talking online, people being like, we got to talk about that. And it really didn't feel like until we got Trials of the Jedi, we had anything really of substance to talk about in terms of spoilers or until in terms of huge plot developments, right? It just felt like we were kind of trudging along through. And so I think learning from the new Jedi Order in that perspective, maybe at least giving your readers, if you're going to stretch this across multiple years, at least giving your readers something to be excited about every year would be ideal. So I think you can learn about that there. I mean, obviously, Clone Wars Multimedia Project had the backbone of TV and had the back connected in between two giant films at the book ending the initiative. So I think that's one that's a little bit unfair to compare it to in terms of the multimedia around there. But one thing I think they could take from there is just more important comic storytelling. Comics were so important in Clone Wars Multimedia Initiative, and they always felt like a B thing here. I can't really think of any comics that made me think, wow, gosh, this is just as compelling, if not better, than what they're doing in the novels. And that's a little bit unfortunate because there are some of the best Clone Wars stories of all time in the comics rather than in the novels and legends. So I think they can get there. It just never felt like they were as interested in making the stories as epic in the comics. The comics were for the comic readers, they weren't for people who were trying to find High Republic stories at the scale that we were getting in the books. And so, like, it's one thing to have. I like that they, especially in phase three, hyper focused on their comic characters, whereas in phase one, I thought one of the things that was the problem there was taking Avar and putting her in the story. It was a nice way to try to have cross pollination between comics and novels, but in doing so, it felt like a lesser version of Avar, kind of a version of Avar that didn't feel really in line with the character at all from Light of the Jedi. And it just kind of took away focus from the characters they were building in the comics. if you I like what they did in phase 3 more focusing on comic characters and just being like, these are our characters, we're gonna ride with them. But in doing so, I never felt like the stories were as important or as interesting. It made the characters a little better, but the stories weren't quite as good. So I think there's just a lot of things that you can learn on the comic side to be truly multimedia. You kind of have to go all in every aspect. And and in this initiative, it felt like they were multimedia, but it was kind of just like, I don't know, the High Republic comics were there, but they were never nearly as important as they could have or should have been. So I think they can learn from Clone Wars multimedia on in that regard. But I think, yeah, I think Legends just did a far better job with hype for their initiatives, and I think that's another final thing they can learn is just compelling people to dive in and really building that hype. Because even with most of these initiatives, it wasn't like there was no Star Wars coming out at the time. Like, we had the prequels actively coming out. We had Clone Wars 2003 to 2005 coming out. We had Clone Wars 2008 coming out. Like, and we still had these epic initiatives in Legends that people were still hyped to read. And so you can do this even in the midst of a lot of Star Wars content existing. I just think by the end they kind of lost steam. I think they lost readership with phase 2. Even though phase 2 was great, there were a lot of people who felt like, do I need to read this? And
Mhm.
waited to hear if it was any good before they fully dived in. And then they started to hear it was good, and then they started to catch up. But then phase 3 was already starting, and it was just kind of, people are slowly catching up altogether. So I feel like those are the things they can learn. It's really more on a structural path for them rather than on something that would be like a storytelling path. Like, storytelling wise, I think they really nailed it with the novels. I just think they can elevate it with the comics. But yeah, that's what we think. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments. Thank you guys for joining us for this special stream, this long super stream about the High Republic. We had a lot of fun chatting with you guys about this. If you guys want to see a full comic stream, let us know. We are planning on still doing our coverage of all these different things. So this wasn't necessarily in place of stuff. We're still planning on doing our tier list for the High Republic, timelines, essential reads, all those types of things that we've done in the past for High Republic. We plan on doing those still. But this was just a fun way to wrap up and discuss with all of you who have been interested in the High Republic over the years and following our channel, because we have been covering it since day one. Hopefully, you guys have enjoyed the journey along the way with us. But thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the stream tonight. We'll be back next Tuesday for our traditional live Q&A. If you want to join us for that, it allows you to ask anything you want about anything, and we will be lifting the High Republic kind of spoiler ban for that stream. So if you want to talk High Republic there as well, come and join us, talk about High Republic. We love talking all things Star Wars there as well. Make sure you check out all our other content. We have content coming out almost every day of the week. We've got Monday and Friday videos. We've got Monday, Wednesday,